The ancient wooden beams of a burial ship emerging from the sandy soil at Sutton Hoo in the summer of 1939 revealed treasures that would fundamentally alter understanding of a civilization long dismissed as barbaric and culturally barren. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The golden helmet with its distinctive face mask and intricate decorative patterns, the jeweled sword fittings bearing craftsmanship that rivaled anything produced in contemporary Byzantine workshops, and the collection of silver bowls, stamped with control marks from the Eastern Mediterranean, demonstrated that the Saxon kingdoms of early medieval England maintained sophisticated cultural connections and possessed artistic capabilities, far exceeding the primitive image that later medieval chroniclers and early modern historians had constructed. The Sutton Hoo burial, likely commemorating an East Anglian king who died around 625, represented only the most spectacular example of archaeological evidence that has progressively revealed the complexity, dynamism, and cultural sophistication of Saxon England during the 4 centuries preceding the Norman Conquest of 1066. The origins of the peoples who would transform the former Roman province of Britannia into England lie not in the misty legends of Hengist and Horsa, arriving at the invitation of the British King Vortigern, but in the complex demographic, economic, and political processes that reshaped the entire Western Roman Empire during the 4th and 5th centuries. The Saxons, along with related Germanic peoples, collectively termed Anglo-Saxons by later historians, originated in the coastal regions of what is now northern Germany and southern Denmark, territories characterized by challenging environmental conditions that had shaped distinctive cultural adaptations and social organizations over many centuries preceding the Roman period. The continental Saxon homelands stretched along the North Sea coast, from the mouth of the Weser River westward to the borders of Frisian territory, encompassing regions where the interaction between land and sea created a landscape of tidal marshes, coastal islands, and fertile but flood-prone agricultural zones that required specialized knowledge and cooperative labor to exploit successfully. Archaeological evidence from settlements like Feddersen-Vierde reveals communities organized around artificial dwelling mounds called turpen or wurten, elevated platforms constructed over generations to protect homes and livestock from the periodic flooding that characterized these low-lying coastal zones. The construction and maintenance of these turpen required substantial communal effort and coordination, creating social bonds and organizational capacities that would prove significant during the later migration period. The economy of these coastal Germanic communities combined pastoral agriculture, emphasizing cattle and sheep herding, with specialized maritime activities, including fishing, seal hunting, and coastal trading that connected them to broader networks extending along the North Sea littoral and into the Baltic region. The environmental challenges of their homeland created populations with extensive practical knowledge of seafaring, navigation, and the construction of seaworthy vessels capable of operating in the treacherous waters where the North Sea met river estuaries and coastal shallows. This maritime expertise, developed over generations of coastal living and trading, would become crucial during the migration period, when these populations sought new territories across the North Sea in Britain. The social organization of continental Saxon communities reflected patterns common to Germanic peoples across northern Europe, with society structured around kinship groups, personal loyalties to powerful leaders, and warrior bands that provided both military protection and social cohesion. The archaeological record reveals increasing social stratification during the Roman Iron Age, with certain individuals and families accumulating greater wealth through control of agricultural resources, success in warfare, or advantageous positions in trading networks. These developing inequalities created competitive pressures among emerging elites who sought to maintain and expand their power through the distribution of gifts to followers, the organization of successful military ventures, and the demonstration of their ability to provide protection and leadership for their communities. The institution of the comitatus, described by the Roman historian Tacitus in his Germania, written in 98, provided the fundamental social mechanism through which ambitious leaders attracted and retained warrior followers through bonds of mutual obligation, gift-giving, and shared participation in warfare and feasting. This social structure, emphasizing personal loyalty between leaders and followers, rather than territorial administration or bureaucratic organization, would fundamentally shape the political development of Saxon England during the centuries following migration. The relationship between continental Saxon populations and the Roman Empire evolved from sporadic raiding and trading contacts during the early imperial period to increasingly frequent military encounters during the 3rd and 4th centuries, as Roman frontier defenses weakened and Germanic populations experienced demographic and political pressures that encouraged expansion. Saxon pirates, operating from coastal bases in swift, shallow draft vessels, began raiding the coasts of Gaul and Britain during the late 3rd century, with sufficient frequency that Roman authorities constructed a chain of fortifications along the vulnerable southeastern British coastline, known to later sources as the Saxon shore forts. These impressive stone fortifications, including sites like Richborough, Reculver, Burgh Castle, and Portchester, combined Roman military architecture with strategic positioning to defend against seaborne raiders, while also serving as bases for the Classis Britannica, the Roman naval force responsible for channel security. The very existence of this elaborate defensive system demonstrates both the seriousness of the Saxon threat during the late Roman period and the empire's continuing commitment to defending the wealthy and strategically important province of Britain, despite growing military pressures along continental frontiers. The circumstances surrounding the end of Roman Britain and the beginning of Saxon settlement remain among the most debated topics in early medieval British history, with limited contemporary written sources and ambiguous archaeological evidence creating space for fundamentally different interpretations of the processes, timeline, and character of this transformation. The traditional narrative, derived primarily from the British monk Gildas, writing in the mid-6th century, and later elaborated by the Venerable Bede in his Ecclesiastical History of the English, people completed in 731, describes a fairly rapid collapse of Roman authority following the withdrawal of imperial military forces around 410, followed by increasing British desperation in the face of attacks from Picts, Scots, and Saxon raiders, leading ultimately to the fateful decision by a British leader named Vortigern to invite Saxon mercenaries to defend against northern invaders. According to this narrative, the Saxon mercenaries under leaders named Hengist and Horsa arrived around 449, initially serving their British employers before rebelling, calling for reinforcements from their continental homelands, and beginning the conquest and settlement that would transform Britain into England. This story, with its dramatic elements of betrayal, conflict, and cultural replacement, dominated historical understanding for centuries and continues to influence popular perceptions of the Anglo-Saxon settlement. However, archaeological evidence and more recent historical analysis suggest a considerably more complex and protracted process involving multiple phases of migration, settlement, cultural interaction, and political transformation that unfolded over several generations, rather than through a single catastrophic invasion. The latest Roman military equipment found at sites across Britain dates to the early 5th century, suggesting that some form of organized defense continued for years, or even decades, after the traditional date of 410 for the end of Roman rule. Evidence for continued economic activity, including the use of Roman coinage and the maintenance of some urban functions in certain cities, indicates that the collapse of Roman Britain was neither instantaneous nor complete across all regions simultaneously. The persistence of British kingdoms in the western and northern regions of the former Roman province, some maintaining recognizable Romano-British cultural elements well into the 6th and 7th centuries, demonstrates that Saxon military and political dominance was achieved gradually through a complex process of conquest, accommodation, and cultural interaction, rather than through immediate overwhelming force. The archaeological evidence for early Saxon settlement in Britain reveals a pattern of initial establishment in coastal and riverine locations, particularly in eastern and southeastern regions, during the 5th century, with gradual expansion inland and westward over subsequent generations. Early Saxon settlements, like West Stow in Suffolk, excavated extensively during the 1960s and 70s, consisted of small agricultural communities with rectangular timber halls and distinctive sunken-featured buildings. Semi-subterranean structures that may have served various functions, including weaving workshops, storage facilities, or ancillary domestic spaces. The material culture recovered from these early settlements, including pottery styles, metalwork techniques, and burial practices, shows clear continuities with continental Saxon traditions, while also beginning to develop distinctive insular characteristics that would eventually define Anglo-Saxon material culture. The gradual nature of these changes, occurring over several generations, suggests ongoing contact with continental homelands, alongside the development of new cultural patterns adapted to British conditions and influenced by interaction with remaining British populations. The distribution pattern of early Saxon settlements, concentrated initially in areas of lighter, more easily worked soils, and avoiding the heavier clay lands that had supported much of the Romano-British agricultural economy, indicates that the incoming Saxon populations possessed different agricultural technologies and preferences than their British predecessors, favouring pastoral agriculture and the cultivation of lighter soils over the intensive grain agriculture that had characterised Roman Britain. The linguistic evidence for Saxon settlement provides additional insight into the nature and extent of population replacement, cultural transformation, and interaction between incoming Germanic speakers and the existing British population. The English language that emerged during the early medieval period derives overwhelmingly from Anglo-Saxon dialects, with relatively limited influence from British Celtic languages, despite the presumably substantial British population that must have existed when Saxon settlement began. This linguistic pattern, unique in the Western Roman world, where Germanic settlers typically adopted Romance languages derived from Latin, rather than imposing their own languages on conquered populations, has generated extensive scholarly debate about the mechanisms and extent of Anglo-Saxon cultural dominance. Some historians argue that the linguistic evidence indicates large-scale population replacement through migration combined with high British mortality from warfare, disease, and social disruption, while others suggest that British populations may have adopted English language and cultural practices while maintaining significant genetic continuity, creating apparent cultural replacement without equivalent demographic transformation. Recent genetic studies of modern British populations reveal complex patterns of ancestry that include both significant Germanic genetic contributions and substantial continuity with earlier British populations, suggesting that the truth likely involves some combination of migration and cultural adoption, with different patterns in different regions and among different social classes. The political geography of early Saxon England emerged through a complex process of kingdom formation, consolidation, and competition that created a patchwork of territorial units, varying enormously in size, power, and stability. The traditional framework of the Heptarchy, describing 7 major kingdoms including Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex, represents a considerable simplification of a more fluid and complicated political landscape that included numerous smaller kingdoms, sub-kingdoms, and political units that appeared, merged, were conquered, or fragmented during the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries. The archaeological and historical evidence suggests that the earliest political units were quite small, perhaps based on individual settlements or groups of related settlements, with larger kingdoms emerging gradually through processes of military conquest, dynastic marriage, the absorption of weaker neighbours, and the development of administrative capabilities that enabled the governance of more extensive territories. The Kingdom of Kent, positioned in the southeastern corner of Britain with easy access to continental trading networks and influenced by continued contact with Frankish Gaul, emerged as one of the earliest and most sophisticated Saxon kingdoms, with kings like Ethelbert, who ruled from approximately 560 to 616, achieving sufficient power and prestige to receive a Christian mission from Rome and established the earliest surviving Anglo-Saxon law code. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity, beginning with the Gregorian mission to Kent in 597 and continuing through the 7th century, represented a transformative process that fundamentally altered Saxon cultural, intellectual, and political development, while connecting England to broader European Christian civilization. Pope Gregory the Great's decision to sponsor a mission to convert the Anglo-Saxons, led by the monk Augustine, who would become the first Archbishop of Canterbury, reflected both genuine religious concern and strategic calculation about expanding papal influence in a region beyond the immediate reach of other ecclesiastical authorities. The initial success of the mission, achieving the conversion of King Ethelbert of Kent and his court within months of arrival, created a foundation for Christian expansion that nevertheless required decades of patient work, strategic alliance building, and accommodation of existing Saxon cultural practices. The early Christian church in Kent, established at Canterbury with Augustine as its first archbishop and supported by Ethelbert's considerable political power, provided a base from which missionaries could work to convert other Saxon kingdoms. Though the pattern of Christianization varied considerably across different regions, with some kingdoms converting through royal initiative, others through the work of individual missionaries, and still others experiencing periods of reversion to paganism before Christianity became firmly established. The parallel development of Celtic Christianity in northern Britain, established through Irish missionaries, working from bases like Lindisfarne, founded by Street, Aidan, in 635, created a situation where two different Christian traditions, with varying practices regarding the calculation of Easter, styles of monastic organization, and ecclesiastical authority competed for influence in Saxon England. The Synod of Whitby convened in 664 to resolve disputes between these traditions, particularly regarding the proper calculation of Easter, which had resulted in the awkward situation of different parts of the Northumbrian court celebrating Easter on different dates, resulted in the decision to follow Roman rather than Celtic practices, a choice with significant implications for England's ecclesiastical organization and cultural orientation toward continental Europe, rather than Ireland and the Celtic West. The resolution of this dispute in favor of Roman practices facilitated the development of a unified English church organized around episcopal sees and archbishoprics at Canterbury and York, while also enabling the kind of systematic ecclesiastical administration that would support the remarkable intellectual and cultural flowering of the Northumbrian Golden Age during the late 7th and 8th centuries. The monasteries established throughout Saxon England during the 7th and 8th centuries became centers of learning, artistic production, and agricultural development that made essential contributions to the preservation and transmission of classical and Christian learning during a period when continental European intellectual culture faced significant disruption. The double monasteries of Northumbria, communities that housed both monks and nuns under the authority of an abbess, typically a woman of royal or noble background, exemplified distinctive Saxon approaches to monastic organization while producing figures of remarkable scholarly achievement. The monastery at Whitby, founded by Street, Hilda, who served as abbess from 657 to 680, became a center of learning that trained bishops and scholars, including Shadman, the illiterate herdsman, who, according to Bede's account, received divine inspiration to compose vernacular religious poetry, creating works that represented the earliest known examples of English literature. The monasteries at Wearmouth and Jarrow, founded by Benedict Biscop in the late 7th century and later home to the Venerable Bede, accumulated libraries containing hundreds of manuscripts imported from Rome and Gaul, providing the textual resources necessary for the sophisticated scholarship that characterized Northumbrian intellectual culture during its golden age. The Venerable Bede himself, living his entire life from 673 to 735 within the monasteries of Wearmouth Jarrow, represents the pinnacle of early medieval English scholarship through his prolific writing in fields, including biblical commentary, chronology, natural science, and history. His ecclesiastical history of the English people, completed in 731, provided not only a comprehensive narrative of the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, but also established chronological frameworks, preserved documentary sources, and demonstrated analytical methods that would influence historical writing for centuries. Bede's use of the Anno Domini dating system, counting years from the birth of Christ, helped establish this chronological framework as the standard for Christian Europe, while his careful citation of sources and his attempts to evaluate the reliability of different types of evidence demonstrated sophisticated historical methodology. Beyond his historical work, Bede produced extensive biblical commentaries that synthesized patristic learning, works on chronology and calendar calculation that required sophisticated mathematical understanding, and scientific treatises, including his work on the nature of time that demonstrated impressive observational and analytical capabilities. The intellectual environment that enabled Bede's achievements reflected both the resources provided by well-endowed monasteries, with extensive libraries, and the broader network of scholarly communication that connected English monasteries to continental learning centers. The artistic achievements of Saxon England during the 7th and 8th centuries, particularly in metalwork, manuscript illumination, and stone sculpture, demonstrated sophisticated technical capabilities and distinctive aesthetic sensibilities that combine Germanic artistic traditions with Christian iconography and Mediterranean influences. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created around 700 by a single scribe and artist, probably Eadfrith, who later became Bishop of Lindisfarne, represent one of the supreme achievements of early medieval manuscript illumination through their combination of intricate interlace patterns derived from Germanic metalwork traditions, elaborate carpet pages that demonstrate extraordinary technical precision and aesthetic sophistication, and figurative illuminations that synthesize influences from Mediterranean Christian art with insular artistic conventions. The technical accomplishment required to create such works, involving the preparation of vellum, the formulation of pigments, including precious materials like lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, and the execution of microscopically precise decorative patterns, indicates highly developed craft specialization and access to international trading networks that could supply exotic materials. The distinctive insular style that emerged in manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Book of Durrow, characterized by elaborate interlace patterns, animal ornament, and the integration of decorative and textual elements into unified artistic compositions, influenced manuscript production throughout Britain and Ireland, while also affecting continental manuscript traditions through the work of Anglo-Saxon missionaries. The metalwork and jewelry produced by Saxon craftsmen during the conversion period and afterward demonstrated technical sophistication in working gold, silver, garnet, and other materials, creating objects that served both decorative and symbolic functions while displaying the wealth and status of their owners. The remarkable assemblage of metalwork discovered at Sutton Hoo, including the gold buckle weighing over 14 ounces and featuring intricate animal interlace decoration, the jeweled sword fittings, and the various items of personal adornment, required highly specialized craft knowledge, including granulation techniques, cloisonné work with precisely cut garnets, and sophisticated approaches to gold working. The symbolic program evident in some of this metalwork, including possible Christian elements alongside traditional Germanic decorative motifs, suggests that Saxon artistic culture during the conversion period maintained complex relationships with both pagan and Christian symbolic systems. The gradual shift from pagan to Christian iconography in Saxon metalwork and sculpture during the 7th and 8th centuries reveals processes of cultural transformation that involved reinterpreting traditional artistic forms within Christian frameworks, rather than simply replacing pagan with Christian art. The development of stone sculpture in Saxon England, particularly the great standing crosses, erected at sites like Ruthwell and Bewcastle during the late 7th or early 8th century, created monumental Christian art that combined Mediterranean iconographic traditions with distinctive insular decorative styles and runic inscriptions. The Ruthwell cross, standing over 17 feet tall and featuring elaborate carved panels depicting scenes from the life of Christ, Latin inscriptions, and portions of the Old English poem The Dream of the Rood in runic characters, demonstrates the synthesis of different cultural traditions that characterize Saxon Christianity during its formative period. The iconographic program of these great crosses, drawing on Mediterranean Christian artistic conventions while adapting them to insular contexts and combining them with vernacular poetic traditions, reflects sophisticated theological understanding and the deliberate use of multiple cultural references to communicate Christian messages to diverse audiences. The technical accomplishment required to carve such elaborate designs on hard sandstone, achieving the precise detail visible in the figural panels and decorative elements, indicates the existence of specialized workshops with developed stone carving traditions, possibly trained through interaction with continental craftsmen or through the study of imported works. The political development of Saxon England during the 7th and 8th centuries saw the gradual emergence of larger, more stable kingdoms through processes of conquest, dynastic marriage, and the development of administrative capabilities that enabled the governance of extensive territories. The Kingdom of Mercia, occupying the Midlands region and strategically positioned to dominate land routes between northern and southern England, emerged during the late 7th century as the most powerful Saxon kingdom under rulers like Penda, who ruled from approximately 632 to 655 and maintained pagan religious practices while competing successfully against Christian rivals, and his successors who converted to Christianity while continuing Mercian expansion. King Offa, who ruled Mercia from 757 to 796, achieved a level of power unprecedented in Saxon England, extending Mercian dominance over most of southern and central England, conducting diplomatic relations with Charlemagne's Frankish Empire on terms approaching equality, and undertaking massive public works, including the great earthwork known as Offa's Dyke, that defined the boundary between Mercia and the Welsh kingdoms. The construction of Offa's Dyke, stretching approximately 150 miles along the Welsh border and requiring the movement of millions of cubic yards of earth, demonstrated organizational capabilities and command over labor resources that indicated the development of more sophisticated royal administration than had characterized earlier Saxon kingdoms. Offa's remarkable achievement in establishing what amounted to a proto-English state, with relatively effective control over most of England south of the Humber, standardized silver coinage that circulated widely and maintained consistent weight and purity standards, and administrative structures capable of organizing large-scale public works and military campaigns, created precedents and infrastructure that would influence subsequent political development, even though Mercian supremacy collapsed within decades of his death in 796. The silver penny that Offa established as standard English coinage, weighing approximately 1.3 grams and featuring the king's name and title along with the name of the moneyer responsible for its production, provided a stable medium of exchange that facilitated commercial activity while also serving as a visible symbol of royal authority distributed throughout the kingdom. The artistic quality of Offa's coinage, with some issues featuring remarkably sophisticated portraiture that may have been influenced by classical Roman models, demonstrated continuing engagement with continental cultural developments and the availability of skilled craftsmen capable of working in miniature with considerable artistic subtlety. The administrative sophistication required to operate a coinage system with consistent standards across multiple minting locations, to regulate the activities of moneyers, and to maintain public confidence in the currency's value, indicated governmental capabilities far exceeding the simple warband leadership that had characterized earlier Saxon political organization. The 8th century prosperity and relative stability that enabled the cultural achievements of the Northumbrian Golden Age and supported Offa's state-building efforts rested on agricultural expansion, improved agricultural techniques, growing commercial activity, and the absence of major external threats that would characterize later periods. The expansion of agricultural settlement during the 7th and 8th centuries, documented through place name evidence and archaeological surveys that reveal the establishment of new settlements in previously unoccupied or lightly settled areas, created the economic foundation for population growth and increased agricultural surplus that could support monastic communities, royal courts, military establishments, and craft specialists. The gradual shift from predominantly pastoral agriculture toward more balanced farming systems that included significant arable cultivation, the clearing of forest land for new fields, and the exploitation of previously marginal lands for agricultural production, indicated both growing population pressure and developing agricultural technologies that enabled more intensive land use. The archaeological evidence for improved agricultural tools, including more effective iron plowshares and the possible introduction of the heavy moldboard plow capable of turning the heavy clay soils that had been difficult to cultivate with earlier implements, suggests technological developments that enhanced agricultural productivity while also requiring cooperative labor arrangements for plow teams that would influence rural social organization. The growing commercial activity evident in 8th century England, including the development of specialized trading settlements called wicks at sites like London, York, and Ipswich, created new opportunities for craft production, long-distance trade, and economic specialization that transformed what had been a largely subsistence economy into a more complex system, with significant market exchange and craft specialization. The trading settlement at Hamwick, located near modern Southampton and flourishing during the 8th century, covered approximately 45 hectares and housed a population engaged in diverse craft activities, including pottery production, metalworking, bone and antler working, and textile production, while also serving as a point of exchange for goods moving between England and the continent. Archaeological excavations at Hamwick have revealed extensive evidence for commercial activity, including substantial quantities of imported pottery from northern France, glass vessels from Frankish territories, lava-quern stones from the Rhineland, and various other materials that demonstrate participation in North Sea and Channel trading networks. The organization of this settlement, with evidence for planned street layouts, property boundaries, and specialized craft working areas, suggests a degree of urban planning and administrative oversight that contrasts with the organic development of earlier settlements. The relationship between royal authority and these trading settlements remains somewhat unclear from the available evidence, but the concentration of high-value goods, the standardization visible in craft production, and the evidence for administrative oversight suggest that kings exercised significant control over these commercial centers, possibly maintaining them as royal estates that generated revenue through market tolls, control of craft production, or direct participation in trade. The development of these specialized trading settlements represented a significant departure from the rural, agriculturally focused economy that had characterized earlier Saxon England, creating new forms of wealth, new categories of specialized craftsmen and merchants whose social positions did not fit traditional categories of noble warriors and peasant farmers, and new sources of royal revenue that would enable the expansion of royal power and administrative capabilities. The integration of England into broader North Sea and Channel trading networks, connecting Saxon ports to Frisia, Francia, and the Rhineland, exposed English craftsmen and consumers to continental products and artistic styles, while creating dependencies on imported goods, particularly luxury items like wine, fine textiles, and metalwork that became markers of elite status. This commercial integration, combined with the ecclesiastical connections established through the English role in continental missionary work and the political relationships maintained through diplomatic exchange and dynastic marriage, embedded England within broader European political and cultural networks. Despite the geographical separation provided by the Channel, the work of English missionaries on the continent during the 8th century, particularly the remarkable achievements of Boniface, who was born in Wessex around 675 and spent most of his adult life working to convert Germanic peoples in Frisia and central Germany before his martyrdom in 754, demonstrated the maturity and confidence of English Christianity while creating enduring connections between England and continental ecclesiastical institutions. Boniface's systematic approach to missionary work, establishing monasteries as bases for Christian expansion, working closely with Frankish secular authorities to secure political support for conversion efforts, and maintaining extensive correspondence with English monasteries and ecclesiastical authorities, created an organizational model for Christian expansion, while also establishing networks of communication and mutual support between English and continental religious communities. The letters that Boniface exchanged with English correspondents, preserved in substantial numbers and providing invaluable insight into 8th century ecclesiastical culture, reveal the intellectual sophistication of English monasticism, the personal relationships that connected religious communities across considerable distances, and the practical concerns that occupied missionary leaders working to establish Christianity in recently converted territories. Boniface's eventual martyrdom at the hands of pagan Frisians while attempting to protect newly converted Christians, though tragic for the missionary enterprise, provided the English Church with a martyr of international significance, whose cult would connect English religious identity to broader European Christian traditions. The disruption of this relatively stable and prosperous period came suddenly and violently with the Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793, an event that contemporaries recognized immediately as marking a fundamental change in the security environment of Saxon England and the beginning of a period of external pressure that would eventually transform the political geography of Britain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's entry for 793 records the raid with unusual detail and evident horror, describing fierce dragons flying in the air, lightning storms, and other portents that preceded the attack, in which heathens destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through rapine and slaughter. The choice of Lindisfarne as a target, a wealthy and prestigious monastery located on a tidal island off the Northumbrian coast, and therefore vulnerable to seaborne assault, while possessing treasures accumulated through decades of royal and aristocratic patronage, revealed the strategic calculation behind Viking raiding that combined reconnaissance of potential targets, assessment of defensive capabilities, and timing of attacks to achieve maximum success with minimum risk. The psychological impact of the Lindisfarne raid, attacking one of the holiest sites in Northumbria, and demonstrating that even the most sacred Christian communities offered no protection against pagan violence, reverberated through Saxon England and prompted widespread questioning about why God had permitted such desecration of a holy place. The Viking raids that followed the Lindisfarne attack gradually intensified during the opening decades of the 9th century, with raiding parties striking coastal and riverine sites throughout Britain and Ireland with increasing frequency and sophistication. The early raids, typically conducted by relatively small groups, arriving in a few ships and targeting monasteries, churches, and other locations with concentrated portable wealth, established patterns of violent assault, rapid seizure of valuable materials, and quick withdrawal that minimized exposure to organized resistance while maximizing the acquisition of gold, silver, ecclesiastical treasures, and captives who could be sold as slaves or held for ransom. The monastic communities that had flourished during the 8th century, typically located in coastal or riverine positions that facilitated trade and communication, but also made them vulnerable to seaborne attack, and accumulating wealth through centuries of patronage, without developing significant defensive capabilities, provided ideal targets for Viking raiders seeking maximum return for minimum risk. The resulting destruction and disruption of monastic life, while not necessarily involving the complete abandonment of all monastic sites, as was once believed, nevertheless had severe consequences for learning and cultural production, as monasteries diverted resources toward defense and basic survival, rather than the copying of manuscripts and the support of scholarly activity. The transformation of Viking activity from seasonal raiding to permanent settlement began in 865, with the arrival of what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the Great Heathen Army, a force of unprecedented size that, rather than conducting hit-and-run raids, established a fortified base in East Anglia and began systematic campaigning to conquer Saxon kingdoms and establish Scandinavian political control over substantial portions of England. The leaders of this army, including figures whom later tradition would identify as the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, seeking vengeance for their father's death at the hands of King Ella of Northumbria, combined military forces from Denmark, Norway, and other Scandinavian territories into a coalition capable of confronting Saxon armies in open battle, while also maintaining the mobility and tactical flexibility that had characterized earlier raiding parties. The Great Heathen Army's strategic approach, establishing fortified bases, exploiting divisions among Saxon kingdoms, making temporary alliances with some rulers against others, and moving rapidly to prevent the concentration of superior Saxon forces against them, demonstrated sophisticated military planning and political calculation that exceeded the capabilities of the fragmented Saxon kingdoms to counter effectively. The rapid collapse of the Saxon kingdoms in the face of the great heathen army's offensive revealed both the military effectiveness of Viking forces and the political fragmentation that prevented effective Saxon resistance. The Kingdom of Northumbria, weakened by internal political divisions and civil war between rival claimants to the throne, fell quickly when the Viking army captured York in 866 and installed a puppet ruler who acknowledged Viking overlordship. The Kingdom of East Anglia suffered a similar fate, with King Edmund, who would later be venerated as a martyr saint after his death at Viking hands in 869, failing to mount effective resistance against forces that possessed superior mobility and cohesion compared to the armies that East Anglian kings could assemble from their dispersed territories. The Kingdom of Mercia, which had dominated southern England during the 8th century, fragmented under Viking pressure during the late 860s and early 870s, with its last independent king fleeing into exile and much of the eastern portion of the kingdom passing under direct Viking control. By 874, only the Kingdom of Wessex remained as an independent Saxon political entity, with the young King Alfred, who had succeeded his brother Ethelred in 871 at approximately age 22, facing the prospect of either submitting to Viking overlordship or continuing resistance against forces that had already destroyed 3 of the 4 major Saxon kingdoms. The crisis that brought Wessex to the brink of extinction occurred in the winter of 877 to 878, when a Viking army under Guthrum launched a surprise attack during the Christmas season, a period when military campaigning traditionally ceased and when Alfred and his court were gathered at Chippenham in a relatively exposed position in northern Wessex. The success of this winter offensive, catching Saxon forces unprepared and scattering the traditional levy of free men who provided military service, before they could be assembled for effective resistance, forced Alfred to flee into the Somerset marshes with a small group of loyal followers and left most of Wessex under Viking occupation. The several months that Alfred spent as a fugitive in the marshlands of Somerset, sheltering on the Isle of Athelney and conducting guerrilla operations against Viking forces while attempting to maintain contact with loyal supporters and plan a counteroffensive, represented the lowest point in the fortunes of Saxon England when the extinction of independent Saxon political authority appeared imminent. The famous, though likely apocryphal story of Alfred burning the cakes while sheltering with a peasant woman who did not recognize him, first recorded in later sources but persistent in popular tradition, reflects the genuine desperation of this period, when the King of Wessex operated as a fugitive in his own kingdom, with his survival and the continuation of Saxon political independence hanging by the most tenuous thread. Alfred's remarkable recovery from this desperate situation, beginning with the assembly of a fighting force from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire in the spring of 878, and culminating in the decisive victory over Guthrum's army at Edington, demonstrated both Alfred's personal capabilities as a military leader and the resilience of Saxon political and social structures in Wessex that enabled the reassembly of effective fighting forces even after apparent comprehensive defeat. The Battle of Edington, fought in May 878, remains poorly documented, with details of the engagement preserved only in brief references in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later accounts that add material of questionable reliability, but the strategic consequences were clear and decisive. Alfred's victory forced Guthrum to accept terms that included his withdrawal from Wessex, his conversion to Christianity with Alfred standing as sponsor at his baptism, and eventually the formal partition of England into Saxon and Viking zones of control, defined by the Treaty of Wedmore and subsequent agreements. The establishment of the Danelaw, the extensive regions of eastern and northern England, where Viking settlers established permanent communities under Scandinavian law and custom, while maintaining varying degrees of political autonomy from both Saxon Wessex and Scandinavian. Kingdoms in Norway and Denmark created a new political geography that would persist until the gradual reconquest of these territories by Alfred's successors during the 10th century. Alfred's achievements during the remainder of his reign, from 878 until his death in 899, extended far beyond military success to encompass administrative, legal, educational, and cultural initiatives that earned him unique recognition as the only English monarch traditionally designated the Great. The military reforms that Alfred implemented, learning from the near disaster of 877 to 878, included the creation of a network of fortified burhs, planned defensive settlements positioned at strategic locations throughout Wessex and capable of providing refuge for surrounding populations, while also serving as bases for military forces that could respond rapidly to Viking attacks. The systematic planning evident in the distribution of these burhs, positioned so that no location in Wessex lay more than 20 miles from a fortified position, and in their standardized defensive designs, with walls constructed according to a formula relating wall length to the number of men required for defense, demonstrated a level of administrative sophistication and strategic vision unprecedented in Saxon England. The Burghall Hidage, a document dating from Alfred's reign, or shortly thereafter, that lists the burhs and specifies the number of hides, units of land assessment, responsible for maintaining each fortification's defences, reveals the administrative infrastructure required to implement this defensive system on a kingdom-wide basis. The naval developments initiated during Alfred's reign, including the construction of ships larger than the Viking vessels that had previously dominated English waters, and designed specifically for intercepting Viking raiders before they could reach vulnerable coastal communities, represented early attempts to address the strategic problem of Viking mobility by developing English naval capabilities that could contest control of the waters around Britain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the construction of ships to Alfred's own design, built to be nearly twice as long as Viking vessels, with 60 oars or more, and intended to be both swifter and more stable than the ships they were meant to counter. While these early experiments in English naval power achieved mixed results, with some successes against Viking raiders, but also notable failures when the unwieldy new vessels ran aground or proved difficult to maneuver in coastal waters, they established principles of naval defense that would be developed more successfully by Alfred's successors. The very conception that Saxon kings should invest resources in naval construction and attempt to contest Viking naval superiority, rather than relying exclusively on land-based defenses, represented strategic innovation that would have long-term consequences for English military development. Alfred's legal initiatives, including the promulgation of a law code that synthesized earlier Saxon laws with biblical precepts and his own modifications, served multiple purposes, including the assertion of royal authority over legal matters, the creation of a written legal tradition that enhanced royal prestige and legitimacy, and the provision of a moral and legal framework that reflected Christian values while accommodating practical realities of Saxon society. The introduction to Alfred's law code, which consists primarily of extensive quotations from the Book of Exodus and other biblical legal material, established the connection between Alfred's legislation and divine law, while positioning the king as the interpreter and enforcer of Christian moral standards in his kingdom. The substantive provisions of the code, dealing with matters ranging from the protection of church property to the regulation of violence and the establishment of compensation rates for various injuries, drew heavily on earlier Saxon legal traditions, including the law codes of Kent, Mercia, and earlier West Saxon kings, but modified and systematized these materials in ways that reflected Alfred's own priorities and contemporary circumstances. The very existence of a royal law code, written in Old English rather than Latin, and therefore accessible to educated laymen as well as clergy, made visible claims about royal authority and the king's role in establishing and maintaining legal order throughout his kingdom. Alfred's educational and cultural initiatives, driven by his personal conviction that the Viking invasions represented divine punishment for the decline of learning and Christian observance in England, sought to reverse what he perceived as catastrophic deterioration in educational standards and to create an educated class of clergy and royal officials capable of reading and understanding religious and secular texts. The preface to Alfred's translation of Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, distributed to every bishopric in his kingdom, lamented that when he became king, he could not recall a single person south of the Thames who could understand the Latin liturgy or translate a Latin letter into English, a situation he contrasted with earlier periods when England had been renowned for learning and when foreign scholars sought instruction from English teachers. While Alfred's assessment probably exaggerated the extent of educational decline for rhetorical purposes, emphasizing the depths from which recovery must occur, the disruption caused by Viking attacks on monasteries, the abandonment of monastic sites, and the interruption of the educational systems centered in monastic schools had indeed severely damaged the infrastructure that had supported the Northumbrian Golden Age and 8th century cultural achievements. Alfred's response involved the recruitment of scholars from Mercia and Wales to his court, the establishment of a court school for the education of young nobles and promising scholars, and an ambitious program of translation that made key Latin texts available in English. The translation program, initiated by Alfred, whether executed by the king himself, as later tradition maintained, or by scholars working under his direction and with his active participation, produced Old English versions of works selected for their educational value and their relevance to the needs of Christian rulers and their advisors. The texts chosen for translation included Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, which provided guidance for bishops in exercising their spiritual and administrative responsibilities, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, which explored the relationship between divine providence and human suffering through a dialogue between the imprisoned Boethius and the personified figure of philosophy, Bede's Ecclesiastical History, which provided a narrative of English Christian origins and models of Christian kingship, and the first 50 Psalms of the Psalter, though this last translation remained incomplete at Alfred's death. The translation methodology employed in these works varied from relatively literal rendering of the Latin originals to free adaptation that added explanatory material, contemporary references, and interpretive comments designed to make the texts more accessible and relevant to 9th century English readers. The interpolation of such additions, particularly evident in the translation of Boethius, where Alfred modified or expanded philosophical discussions to reflect his own understanding and to address concerns specific to his context, has generated scholarly debate about authorial intent and the nature of translation in early medieval culture, but clearly indicates that the objective was not simply to transfer information from Latin to English, but to create new works that would serve the educational and spiritual needs of Alfred's kingdom. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the vernacular historical record maintained at Alfred's court, and subsequently continued at various monastic sites for more than 2 centuries after his death, represented another dimension of Alfred's cultural program and his concern with preserving historical memory and establishing a narrative framework for understanding the Saxon past and present. The compilation of the Chronicle during the late 880s or early 890s, drawing on earlier chronological records, oral traditions, and the historical works, like Bede's Ecclesiastical History, created a year-by-year account of English history from the Roman invasion through contemporary events. The decision to maintain this chronicle in Old English rather than Latin, unusual for a historical work during this period, and reflecting the same concerns with vernacular accessibility that motivated the translation program, ensured that the historical knowledge it contained could be understood by educated laypeople as well as clergy. The political dimensions of the chronicle, which presented West Saxon kings as the primary defenders of English Christianity against pagan Vikings, and positioned Wessex as the legitimate heir to earlier English kingdoms, served ideological purposes that supported Alfred's claims to authority, while also preserving historical information that would otherwise have been lost. The remarkable personal qualities that enabled Alfred to lead Wessex from the desperate circumstances of 878 to relative security and cultural revival by his death in 899 emerged. Despite, or perhaps because of the physical afflictions that plagued him throughout his adult life, the medical condition that caused Alfred recurring and severe abdominal pain, described in Asser's contemporary biography of the king, with details suggesting a chronic gastrointestinal disorder, did not prevent him from sustained military campaigning, intensive administrative work, and active participation in the scholarly activities of his court. The coping mechanisms that Alfred developed for managing his illness, including the establishment of regular schedules for different activities, the systematic allocation of time between religious observance, royal administration, personal study, and other responsibilities, and the maintenance of intellectual engagement during periods when physical pain prevented more active pursuits, reflected a disciplined and methodical approach to the challenges of kingship that contrasted with the more improvisational leadership styles characteristic of earlier Saxon rulers. The personal piety that characterized Alfred's approach to kingship, evident in his concern with divine judgment, his regular participation in religious services, his patronage of churches and monasteries, and his integration of Christian moral teachings into his legal and political initiatives, established models of Christian kingship that would influence his successors and shape ideals of royal behavior throughout the medieval period. Alfred's death in 899, probably on October 26th, brought to the throne his son Edward, known to later generations as Edward the Elder, who would continue and expand his father's work of defending Wessex against Viking attacks, while beginning the systematic reconquest of the Danelaw territories that had been under Viking control since the 860s and Fusty 870s. Edward's position at his accession was complicated by the rival claim of his cousin Ethelwold, son of Alfred's elder brother King Ethelred, who argued that he possessed superior hereditary right to the throne and who attempted to seize power through a rebellion that gained support from Viking rulers in the Danelaw. The suppression of this challenge, culminating in Ethelwold's death in battle in 902, while fighting alongside his Viking allies against Edward's forces, demonstrated both the persistence of succession disputes that would trouble Saxon kingship throughout the 10th century, and Edward's capability in dealing with combined internal and external threats to his authority. The resolution of this succession crisis in Edward's favour, combined with his successful defence of Wessex against subsequent Viking attacks and his gradual extension of West Saxon authority over neighbouring territories, established the foundation for the ambitious programme of territorial expansion that would characterise the middle period of his reign. The reconquest of the southern Danelaw, the Viking-controlled territories south of the Humber River, including the 5 boroughs of Leicester, Nottingham, Derby, Stamford, and Lincoln, proceeded through a combination of military campaigns, the construction of fortified burhs that extended the defensive system Alfred had established in Wessex into newly conquered territories, and the establishment of administrative structures that integrated these regions into an expanding West Saxon kingdom. Edward's strategy, developed in coordination with his sister Ethelflad, who ruled the Mercian kingdom as Lady of the Mercians after her husband's death in 911, involved coordinated advances from Wessex and Mercia that prevented Viking forces from concentrating against either English army while progressively restricting Viking-controlled territory. The construction of fortifications at strategic locations, including Hertford, Witham, Buckingham, Bedford, Stamford, and Nottingham, established during campaigns conducted between 912 and 918, created a network of defensive positions that secured conquered territories while providing bases for further advances. The systematic nature of this advance, moving methodically from south to north and consolidating control over each region before proceeding further, contrasted with earlier patterns of Saxon-Viking conflict that had involved more episodic warfare without sustained territorial conquest. Ethelflad's remarkable career as ruler of Mercia, governing independently from 911 until her death in 918, and conducting military campaigns, building fortifications, and managing diplomatic relationships without subordination to her brother's authority, despite being a woman in a political system that generally excluded women from formal political power, demonstrated both her exceptional personal capabilities and the flexibility of early medieval political arrangements when circumstances demanded innovative solutions. The fortifications that Ethelflad constructed throughout Mercia, including sites at Surgat, Bridgenorth, Tamworth, Stafford, Edisbury, Warwick, Cherbury, Weardbyrige, and Runcorn, extended the burh system into the Midlands and Welsh borderlands, while also serving to assert Mercian identity and authority distinct from West Saxon power. Aethelflaed's diplomatic and military relationships with Welsh kingdoms, with Viking rulers in the Danelaw, and with the Northumbrian Vikings at York, navigating a complex political landscape where alliances shifted frequently and where threats could emerge from multiple directions simultaneously, required sophisticated political judgment and the establishment of credible military power that could deter aggression while supporting diplomatic initiatives. The submission to Aethelflaed's authority by Viking rulers in Derby and by significant elements of the York Vikings in 918, shortly before her death, represented the culmination of her political and military achievements. Though her death prevented her from consolidating these gains, the annexation of Mercia by Edward, following Aethelflaed's death in 918, deposing her daughter Elfwin, who briefly succeeded her mother, and bringing the Mercian kingdom under direct West Saxon rule, eliminated the last independent English kingdom outside of Wessex and created for the first time a unified English kingdom under a single ruling dynasty. The political consolidation that this represented, bringing together regions with distinct histories, political traditions, and in some cases, different ethnic backgrounds, into a single administrative structure ruled from Wessex, required careful management of regional identities and the incorporation of Mercian nobles and ecclesiastical authorities into positions within the expanding kingdom. Edward's ability to manage this transition without provoking serious Mercian resistance to West Saxon domination, maintaining the loyalty of Mercian military forces while integrating Mercian territories into his kingdom's administrative structures, demonstrated political skills that complemented his military capabilities and his father's institutional innovations. The conquest of the southern Danelaw, completed by 920, with Edward's acceptance of submission from Viking rulers throughout the region, and his assumption of direct authority over the 5 boroughs, extended English royal power to the Humber River for the first time since the collapse of Northumbria in the 860s. Edward's final years, from 920 until his death in 924, saw him consolidating control over conquered territories, establishing administrative structures in regions that had been under Viking rule for over 50 years, and receiving submissions from rulers throughout Britain, including Welsh kings, the King of Scots, and various Northern English and Viking leaders who acknowledged his overlordship in ceremonies at Bakewell in 920 and at other locations. The precise meaning of these submissions, whether they represented genuine acceptance of Edward's authority or merely formal acknowledgement of his military power without substantive transfer of sovereignty, remains debated by historians, but they clearly indicated that Edward had achieved a level of power and prestige unprecedented in English history, and that contemporaries recognized the transformation of the political landscape that his conquests represented. The designation that began to appear in royal documents during Edward's reign, describing him as King of the Anglo-Saxons, rather than simply King of Wessex, reflected this expanded authority and the emergence of a unified English identity that transcended the earlier divisions between separate Saxon kingdoms. The transformation of multiple independent kingdoms into a unified English state under a single dynasty, accomplished over the 2 generations spanning Alfred's and Edward's reigns through a combination of military conquest, administrative innovation, and the construction of institutional frameworks capable of governing diverse territories, represented one of the most significant political developments in medieval European history. The succession of Edward's son Aethelstan in 924, though contested by his half-brother Edwin and complicated by questions about Aethelstan's legitimacy, since his mother's marriage to Edward may not have been fully canonical, ultimately proved secure and brought to the throne perhaps the most militarily successful and politically sophisticated of all Anglo-Saxon kings. Aethelstan's education at the Mercian court of his aunt Aethelflaed, providing him with first-hand experience of Mercian political culture and establishing relationships with Mercian nobles that would prove valuable when he became king, prepared him for the challenges of ruling a kingdom that included regions with distinct identities and political traditions. The early years of his reign saw him consolidating control over territories that his father had conquered, suppressing opposition, including what may have been an attempted rebellion by his brother Edwin, who drowned in suspicious circumstances in 933, and extending royal authority into regions that had acknowledged Edward's overlordship, but maintained substantial autonomy. The conquest of York in 927, expelling the Viking king Guthfrith and bringing the last major centre of Viking power in England under direct English royal control, represented Æthelstan's first major military achievement and extended his authority to England's northern frontier. The submission of rulers throughout Britain to Æthelstan's authority at a great assembly at Aymont in 927, where the King of Scots, the King of Strathclyde, and various northern English and Welsh rulers acknowledged his overlordship, created what contemporaries recognised as an unprecedented extension of English royal power, and established Æthelstan's claim to authority over all of Britain. The precise constitutional significance of these submissions, whether they created genuinely hierarchical relationships with Æthelstan, exercising superordinate authority, or merely acknowledged his military power without substantive changes in political relationships, has been debated by modern historians, but contemporary sources treated them as marking Æthelstan's achievement of a new level of royal dignity, approaching that of Charlemagne and other great European rulers. The styling that appeared in Æthelstan's royal charters, describing him as King of the English and ruler of all Britain, while representing rhetorical exaggeration of his actual power, nevertheless indicated how contemporaries understood the significance of his achievements and the transformation of English kingship that his reign represented. The Battle of Brunanburh in 937, where Æthelstan confronted a coalition of enemies, including the King of Scots, the King of Dublin Vikings, who had reclaimed control of York, and the King of Strathclyde, represented the most serious challenge to English power during his reign, and produced one of the most celebrated military victories in Anglo-Saxon history. The campaign that led to this confrontation began when the Viking king Olaf Guthfrithson sailed from Dublin with a substantial fleet and army, reclaimed control of York from English garrisons, and formed alliances with Scottish and British rulers who resented English overlordship and saw opportunity in the concentration of Viking military power. Æthelstan's response, assembling an army that included forces from throughout England and marching north to confront the coalition, demonstrated both his ability to mobilize military resources from recently conquered territories and the political integration that had occurred since his accession. The battle itself, though poorly documented in surviving sources with details of the engagement, preserved primarily in a celebratory poem included in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and in fragmentary references in other sources, resulted in decisive English victory, with heavy casualties among the coalition forces, including several kings and earls killed in the fighting. The poem celebrating the Battle of Brunanburh, composed shortly after the engagement, and representing one of the finest examples of Old English martial poetry, describes the fighting with vivid imagery of swords cutting through shields, blood flowing across battlefields, ravens and eagles feasting on the corpses of the defeated, and the pursuing English forces cutting down fleeing enemies. The poem's emphasis on this being the greatest battle fought in Britain since the Anglo-Saxon settlement, its detailed attention to the distinguished casualties among Æthelstan's enemies, and its celebration of the king's vindication of his claims to overlordship, all indicate that contemporaries recognize Brunanburh as a defining moment in the consolidation of English power and the establishment of English military superiority throughout Britain. The deaths of 5 kings and 7 earls on the coalition side, if the poem's account can be trusted, represented a devastating blow to the political leadership of regions that had challenged English authority and removed from the scene figures who might have organized further resistance. Æthelstan's survival and victory, achieved despite facing numerically superior forces and fighting far from his core territories in Wessex, demonstrated both his military capabilities and the effectiveness of the military organization and tactical systems that had been developed by Alfred and his successors. The remainder of Æthelstan's reign, from 937 until his death in 939, saw him consolidating the gains achieved at Brunanburh and developing the administrative and cultural dimensions of his kingship in ways that would influence English royal governance for generations. The royal court that Æthelstan maintained, attracting scholars and clerics from throughout England and from continental Europe, visiting foreign rulers and dignitaries, and serving as a centre for legal, administrative, and cultural activities, represented the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan royal establishment that England had yet seen. The law codes issued during Æthelstan's reign, addressing matters ranging from the regulation of trade to the punishment of theft and the maintenance of peace throughout the kingdom, demonstrated increasing sophistication in royal legislation and the extension of royal legal authority into areas previously regulated primarily through local custom. The concern evident in these laws with establishing standardized legal procedures across the diverse regions that comprised Æthelstan's kingdom, with suppressing theft and maintaining order, and with defining relationships between royal authority and local governance structures, reflected the practical challenges of ruling territories that had been integrated into the English kingdom only recently, and that maintained distinct legal traditions. The cultural achievements of Æthelstan's reign, while less celebrated than those of Alfred's court, nevertheless included significant developments in manuscript production, the collection and preservation of books and relics, and the patronage of churches and monasteries throughout the kingdom. Æthelstan's personal interest in collecting books, relics, and other precious objects, documented through surviving manuscripts that bear inscriptions recording their donation by the king to various religious institutions, created connections between the royal court and ecclesiastical establishments throughout England, while also demonstrating the king's piety and concern with supporting religious life. The network of relationships with continental rulers that Æthelstan cultivated, including marriage alliances that saw several of his sisters married to continental kings and princes, positioned England within broader European political systems and facilitated cultural exchanges that brought continental artistic and intellectual influences to England. The gifts exchanged between Æthelstan and continental rulers, including precious manuscripts, relics, and works of art that moved between England and the continent, created material connections that complemented the diplomatic relationships while also influencing English artistic production through exposure to continental styles and techniques. Æthelstan's death in 939, probably on October 27th, brought to the throne his half-brother Edmund, who inherited a kingdom that had achieved unprecedented unity and power, but that faced immediate challenges from Viking forces seeking to reverse the English conquests of the previous 15 years. The invasion of England by Olaf Guthfrithson, the Dublin Viking king who had escaped from Brunanburh and now returned seeking vengeance and the recovery of his kingdom at York, found Edmund unprepared and resulted in Viking reconquest of the 5 boroughs and York within the first year of the new king's reign. The rapidity of this Viking success, reversing in months conquests that had required decades to achieve, revealed both the continuing instability of English control over recently conquered Danelaw territories and the challenges facing a young and inexperienced king thrust into power at age 18. Edmund's initial attempts to reverse these losses through military campaigns achieved limited success, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage in fighting that devastated the regions contested between English and Viking forces, but that did not produce clear resolution. The treaty negotiated between Edmund and Olaf in 940, establishing Watling Street as the boundary between English and Viking-controlled territory, and thereby conceding to Viking control all of the reconquered Danelaw territories, represented a humiliating setback for English power and seemed to reverse the achievements of Edward and Æthelstan. However, Olaf Guthfrithson's death in 941, while raiding in the Midlands, created opportunities for Edmund to recover lost territories, particularly when Olaf's successor and cousin Olaf Sistriksson proved less capable as a military leader and political organizer. Edmund's reconquest of the 5 boroughs in 942, celebrated in a poem included in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that describes him as liberating the Danes of these territories from cruel oppression under Norse Vikings and returning them to proper English rule, restored English authority over the southern Danelaw, and demonstrated both improved English military effectiveness and the political advantages that Edmund gained from Olaf Guthfrithson's death. The expulsion of both Olaf Sistriksson and another Viking leader named Ragnald from York in 944 completed Edmund's recovery of territories lost at the beginning of his reign and re-established English control over Northumbria. The swiftness of this recovery, accomplished within 5 years of his accession and reversing what had appeared to be catastrophic defeats, vindicated Edmund's perseverance and demonstrated the resilience of the English kingdom that his predecessors had constructed. Edmund's relationship with the Northumbrian Church, and particularly with Archbishop Wulfstan of York, who had maintained his position under Viking rulers, and whose political loyalties remained ambiguous during this period of shifting control, revealed the practical compromises necessary for governing newly conquered territories, where local elites possessed their own power bases, and where the population's attachment to English rule remained uncertain. Wulfstan's position, serving as archbishop under both English and Viking rulers, and advising whoever controlled York, while maintaining the independence and interests of the Northumbrian Church, exemplified the adaptability of ecclesiastical authorities who survived repeated changes in political control by providing essential administrative expertise and religious legitimacy to whoever held power. Edmund's acceptance of Wulfstan's continued authority despite the archbishop's accommodation with Viking rulers, recognizing that effective governance of Northumbria required working with existing power structures rather than attempting wholesale replacement of local elites, demonstrated political sophistication that contrasted with the more confrontational approaches that might have been expected from a young king recently humiliated by Viking conquests. The devastating of Strathclyde in 945, undertaken in response to that kingdom's previous alliance with Viking forces and designed to punish its ruler for supporting English enemies, represented Edmund's most controversial military action and revealed the ruthless calculation that could characterize English royal policy toward northern British kingdoms. The campaign involved systematic destruction of agricultural resources, the burning of settlements, and violence against civilian populations designed to cripple Strathclyde's ability to threaten English interests for years to come. The subsequent ceding of devastated Strathclyde territories to Malcolm, King of Scots, in return for his alliance and military support, created a relationship of mutual interest between English and Scottish rulers that helped secure England's northern frontier, while also establishing precedents for English intervention in Scottish politics. This arrangement, which effectively made the Scottish king Edmund's client while providing him with control over territories that England had devastated but could not directly administer, demonstrated Edmund's strategic thinking about how to manage threats from Britain's northern regions without the massive military commitments that would have been required for direct English rule. Edmund's sudden death in 946, stabbed by an exiled criminal named Leofa during a feast at the royal estate of Pucklechurch, brought his reign to a premature end and created a succession crisis since his sons were young children incapable of ruling. The accession of his brother Edred, the last surviving son of Edward the Elder, maintained dynastic continuity and prevented the succession disputes that might have erupted if more distant relatives had pressed their claims to the throne. Edred's reign, from 946 until 955, faced continuing challenges from Viking forces in York, where the Norwegian king Eric Bloodaxe established himself as ruler and maintained power despite repeated English military campaigns and diplomatic efforts to expel him. The protracted struggle for control of York during the late 940s and early 950s, involving shifting alliances among Northumbrian nobles, interventions by Dublin Vikings, and repeated English military expeditions that achieved temporary success but failed to establish permanent control, demonstrated the persistent difficulty of extending effective English authority over Northumbria. The final expulsion and death of Eric Bloodaxe in 954 ended independent Viking rule in York and brought Northumbria under more direct English control, though the region would maintain distinctive political characteristics throughout the remainder of the Anglo-Saxon period. Edred's death in 955 brought to the throne Edmund's eldest son Eadwig, who had reached sufficient age to rule but whose brief reign proved troubled by political conflicts with powerful nobles and ecclesiastical authorities. The specific causes of the bitter disputes between Edwig and various powerful figures, including Archbishop Oda of Canterbury and the influential nobleman and ecclesiastic Dunstan, remain obscure from surviving sources, but clearly involved factional conflicts at court and possibly Eadwig's marriage to Elfgifu, which ecclesiastical authorities challenged as uncanonical due to the couple's consanguinity within degrees prohibited by church law. The political crisis that erupted in 957, when the Mercians and Northumbrians rejected Eadwig's authority and elevated his younger brother Edgar to rule these regions, while Eadwig retained control only over Wessex, revealed the continuing possibility of political fragmentation and the conditional nature of the unity that previous kings had achieved through military conquest. The division of the kingdom along the Thames, with Edgar ruling north of the river and Eadwig confined to Wessex and the southeast, recreated the political geography that had existed before Edward the Elder's conquests and threatened to reverse permanently the unification that had been accomplished over the previous half-century. Eadwig's death in 959 at approximately age 18 or 19, possibly from disease, though later sources would hint at more sinister explanations, reunited the kingdom under Edgar and inaugurated what would be remembered as the most peaceful and prosperous period of Anglo-Saxon England. Edgar's reign from 959 until 975 saw minimal external military threats, successful management of relationships with Viking settlers in the Danelaw and with British kingdoms in Wales and Scotland, and internal developments, including monastic reform and administrative innovation, that would have lasting consequences for English ecclesiastical and political organization. The absence of recorded battles or major military campaigns during Edgar's reign, unusual for an Anglo-Saxon king and later prompting questions about his martial abilities, reflected both the success of his predecessors in defeating Viking threats and Edgar's own diplomatic skills in managing relationships with potential enemies through negotiation rather than warfare. The legendary account of Edgar's rowing on the River Dee, accompanied by 8 sub-kings who acknowledged his overlordship, probably an invention or embellishment by later writers, but nevertheless reflecting how Edgar's reign was remembered, symbolized the peaceful submission of Britain's various rulers to English authority and the achievement of a stable hierarchical political order. The monastic reform movement that flourished during Edgar's reign, led by 3 remarkable ecclesiastical figures including Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, Ethelwald, Bishop of Winchester, and Oswald, Archbishop of York, transformed English religious life through the re-establishment of strict Benedictine monasticism, the reform or replacement of existing religious communities that had departed from monastic rules, and the creation of new monasteries that would become centers of learning, artistic production, and spiritual life. The reformers' vision, influenced by continental monastic reforms, particularly those associated with the monastery of Cluny in France and with the Lotharingian reform movement, emphasized strict observance of the Benedictine rule, the importance of liturgical precision and elaboration, the cultivation of learning and artistic production in service of religion, and the separation of monks from secular concerns through the maintenance of monastic estates that could support contemplative life without dependence on secular patrons. The implementation of this program, requiring the removal of married clergy from religious houses, the introduction of monks trained in strict Benedictine observance, and the endowment of monasteries with substantial landed estates that could support reformed communities, generated significant opposition from displaced clerics and from nobles who resented the transfer of lands to monastic control. Edgar's strong support for the reformers, providing them with royal backing for controversial changes, and using royal authority to override opposition from nobles and from displaced secular clergy, reflected both genuine piety and strategic calculation about the benefits of alliance with reformed monasticism. The monasteries established or reformed during this period, including houses at Glastonbury under Dunstan's direction, Winchester and Ely under Ethelwald's leadership, and Worcester, Ramsey, and other sites associated with Oswald's work, became centers of education and manuscript production that created the cultural foundations for the late Anglo-Saxon, flowering in art, literature, and learning. The distinctive Winchester style of manuscript illumination that emerged during this period, characterized by elaborate acanthus borders, dynamic figure drawing influenced by Carolingian and Byzantine models, and the integration of text and decoration into unified aesthetic programs, represented the artistic culmination of the monastic reform movement, and produced works including the Benedictional of Ethelwold, that rank among the supreme achievements of medieval art. The production of such elaborate manuscripts, requiring expensive materials including gold, leaf, and exotic pigments, specialized scribal and artistic skills developed through years of training, and the leisure to devote months or years to single projects, depended on the economic resources and institutional stability that Reformed monasteries possessed through their landed endowments and royal patronage. The Regularis Concordia, a monastic customary compiled around 973 under Edgar's sponsorship and establishing standardized observances for English Benedictine monasteries, represented an attempt to create uniformity in monastic practice throughout England, while also defining the relationship between monasteries and royal authority. The inclusion in the Regularis Concordia of special prayers for the king and royal family, to be performed daily in all monasteries, made explicit the connection between Reformed monasticism and the monarchy, while creating religious obligations that reinforced political relationships. The document's provisions regarding the election of abbots, specifying that elections should occur with the advice and consent of the king, formalized royal involvement in monastic governance, and ensured that Reformed houses would maintain close connections to royal power. The ceremonial elaboration prescribed in the Regularis Concordia, including detailed instructions for the performance of the liturgy throughout the church year, and specifications for special observances, including the dramatic Visitatio Sepulchri ceremony performed on Easter morning, created a magnificent liturgical program that made Reformed monasteries centers of ceremonial splendor that could rival royal courts in their display of wealth and cultural sophistication. Edgar's consecration as king in 973 at Bath, performed when he had already ruled for 14 years, but deliberately delayed until he reached the age of 30, that canonical requirements specified for ordination to the episcopate, created a model for royal inauguration that would influence English coronation ceremonies for centuries. The ceremony, performed by Archbishop Dunstan, incorporated elements derived from Carolingian and Byzantine royal rituals, including the anointing of the king with holy oil that symbolically transformed him from a secular ruler into a sacred figure with quasi-priestly status, the investment with crown, scepter, and other regalia that represented the transfer of royal power, and the oath that bound the king to maintain peace, suppress wrongdoing, and show mercy and justice in all his judgments. The theological meaning invested in this ceremony, presenting the king as chosen and sanctified by God to rule as his representative and to maintain Christian order in his kingdom, elevated royal authority while also subjecting it to divine judgment and ecclesiastical oversight. The political implications of this coronation, performed with unprecedented splendor and attended by ecclesiastical and secular magnates from throughout England, demonstrated Edgar's power and prestige, while also establishing precedents for how kingship would be understood and inaugurated in subsequent reigns. Edgar's death in 975 brought to a sudden end the stability and prosperity that had characterized his reign and plunged England into succession, crisis, and political turmoil. The competition between Edgar's sons, Edward and Ethelred, the former born of an irregular union whose canonical status remained questionable, and the latter the offspring of Edgar's later marriage to Elfrith, divided the nobility and ecclesiastical hierarchy into factions supporting rival candidates. The eventual accession of Edward, supported by Archbishop Dunstan and other leading ecclesiastics, despite questions about his legitimacy, created resentment among nobles who favoured Ethelred, and particularly among supporters of Queen Elfrith, who saw her son displaced by a rival of questionable birth. Edward's brief reign, from 975 to 978, proved troubled by political opposition, economic difficulties, possibly related to harvest failures, and the king's own difficult personality that contemporary sources describe as volatile and prone to violent outbursts. The murder of Edward at Corfe Castle in Dorset on March 18, 978, where he had stopped while visiting his stepmother Elfrith and half-brother Ethelred, removed from the scene a divisive figure whose continuation on the throne might have provoked more serious political crisis, but created in his death the conditions for his veneration as a martyr and saint. The circumstances of Edward's murder, remain deliberately obscure in contemporary accounts, with sources providing only vague descriptions of the king being killed by members of Ethelred's household while receiving a cup of wine, without specifying whether Ethelred, his mother Elfthryth, or others bore responsibility for planning the assassination. The rapid burial of Edward's body without royal honours, initially at Wareham and only later with more ceremony at Shaftesbury, suggested that those responsible for his death sought to minimise attention to circumstances that might provoke questions about the new king's involvement. The subsequent development of a popular cult venerating Edward as a martyr, with miracles reported at his tomb and pilgrims seeking healing through contact with his relics, created a politically awkward situation where the former king's sanctity implicitly questioned the legitimacy of those who had benefited from his death. The formal recognition of Edward as Street, Edward the Martyr, and the promotion of his cult by ecclesiastical authorities who had supported his accession represented both genuine religious devotion and political positioning by figures who sought to distance themselves from masses. Suspicions of involvement in regicide. The reign of Ethelred, who became king at approximately age 10 and would rule until his death in 1016, proved to be one of the most troubled and ultimately disastrous periods in Anglo-Saxon history. Though the king's reputation has been complicated by the hostile sources that shaped later historical memory of these decades, the nickname Unrad that became attached to Ethelred, often mistranslated as the Unready, but actually meaning ill-counselled or lacking in good counsel, reflected contemporary judgment about the quality of advice the king received from his noble counsellors, rather than being a comment on his personal qualities, though later tradition would interpret it as indicating incompetence. The early years of Ethelred's reign, conducted under the guidance of powerful nobles, including Ethelwine of East Anglia and Archbishop Dunstan, who dominated governance during the king's minority, maintained relative stability despite the controversial circumstances of his accession. However, the renewal of Viking raiding that began in the 980s, initially on a limited scale, but gradually intensifying throughout the 990s and into the early 11th century, created military and political challenges that overwhelmed the defensive systems established by earlier kings and exposed fundamental weaknesses in English political organisation. The Viking forces that attacked England during Ethelred's reign differed from earlier raiders in their organisation, leadership, and objectives, representing well-organised military forces led by ambitious Scandinavian leaders seeking wealth through systematic exploitation of England's prosperity rather than random opportunistic raids. The leaders of these forces, including the Norwegian Olaf Tryggvason, who would later become King of Norway, and the Danish king Svein Forkbeard, who ultimately sought to conquer England and add it to his domains, commanded professional warriors whose fighting capabilities and tactical sophistication exceeded those of earlier Viking raiders. The English response to these attacks, initially attempting to maintain the defensive systems of fortified burhs and local military forces that had succeeded against earlier Viking threats, proved increasingly ineffective as the scale and coordination of Viking attacks overwhelmed local defences and revealed the difficulty of assembling and maintaining national military forces capable of confronting well-organised Viking armies. The decision to pay tribute to Viking forces, first implemented on a large scale in 991, when Archbishop Sigeric of Canterbury negotiated a payment of £10,000 of silver to purchase the withdrawal of a Viking army besieging London, established a pattern that would dominate English responses to Viking attacks for the remainder of Ethelred's reign. These payments, later called Danegeld by historians, though contemporary sources used various terms, represented rational responses to immediate military threats by a government that lacked the military capacity to defeat Viking forces through direct confrontation, and that calculated that purchasing temporary peace cost less than the mecenate damage that continued warfare would inflict. However, the precedent of paying tribute created perverse incentives that encouraged further Viking attacks, as successful raiders returned with larger forces seeking greater payments, while news of English willingness to pay tribute attracted additional Scandinavian leaders seeking easy wealth. The massive scale of tribute payments during Ethelred's reign totaling at least £160,000 of silver, recorded in surviving sources, and possibly significantly more, represented an enormous drain on English economic resources that required heavy taxation, the melting down of church plate and personal treasures, and the exploitation of royal estates to raise the necessary funds. The Street Bryce's Day Massacre of November 13, 1002, in which Ethelred ordered the killing of Danes throughout England, represented a desperate and ultimately counterproductive attempt to eliminate the Viking threat through violent action against settlers who had long resided peacefully in England. The order specified that all Danes in England should be killed on this single day, though the practical implementation of such a command varied considerably across different regions, with some areas apparently conducting organized massacres, while others ignored the order or protected their Danish neighbors. The execution of this policy in Oxford, where Danes seeking sanctuary in a church were burned alive when the building was set on fire by townspeople carrying out the king's command, exemplified the violence that royal authorization unleashed against vulnerable populations. The massacre's most significant consequence proved to be its effect on King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark, whose sister Gunhild reportedly died in the killings, and whose response involved launching a massive retaliatory invasion that began England's final descent into conquest and political collapse. Svein's campaigns in England from 1003 through 1005 devastated extensive regions, particularly in the west and southwest, with his forces conducting systematic destruction of settlements, agricultural resources, and ecclesiastical properties, while extracting tribute payments and demonstrating the English government's inability to provide protection or organize effective resistance. The failure of English military forces to confront Svein's army effectively, despite the assembly of national levies on multiple occasions, reflected command problems, coordination failures, and possibly betrayal by nobles whose loyalty to Ethelred had become questionable as the king's inability to defend the kingdom became increasingly apparent. The chronicle accounts of these years read as a litany of failure, with English armies assembling too late, arriving at wrong locations, or simply refusing to engage Viking forces, while Danish raiders moved freely throughout the country and English commanders appeared paralyzed by indecision or undermined by factional conflicts. The murder of Elfheir, Archbishop of Canterbury, by drunken Vikings at Greenwich in 1012, after he refused to allow his ransom to be paid, illustrated both the violence of this period and the collapse of the political and social order that should have protected even the most exalted ecclesiastical figures. The restoration of relative stability from 1006 through 1013, following Svein's temporary withdrawal and the payment of massive tribute, proved deceptive, as Svein planned for not just another raid, but the permanent conquest of England. The invasion that Svein launched in 1013 differed from earlier campaigns in its systematic character and clear objective of political conquest, rather than mere plunder. Beginning in the Danelaw, where he could expect support from areas with substantial Scandinavian populations, Svein moved methodically southward, receiving the submission of regional after regional, until by the end of the year, he controlled all of England except London, where Ethelred maintained a desperate defence. The flight of Ethelred to Normandy in December 1013, taking refuge with his wife's relatives at the Norman court and abandoning England to Svein's control, marked the first time that an English king had been driven from his kingdom by foreign invasion since the Saxon conquest centuries earlier. Svein's sudden death in February 1014, after only weeks as acknowledged king of all England, created an unexpected opportunity for Ethelred's restoration, but the political damage had been done, and the precedent established that England could be conquered by well-organized Scandinavian forces. Ethelred's return, in the spring of 1014, negotiated with English nobles, who invited him back, but only after he agreed to reform the abuses of his previous governance and rule more justly, demonstrated both his continuing legitimacy in English eyes and the conditional nature of that legitimacy after his abandonment of the kingdom. The competition with Svein's son, Knut, who maintained his own claim to the English throne based on his father's conquest, and who possessed military forces and support from sections of the English population, particularly in the Danelaw, created an unstable situation with neither side possessing overwhelming strength. The military stalemate that characterized 1014 and 1015, with neither Ethelred nor Cnut able to achieve decisive victory, and with England divided between regions acknowledging different rulers, devastated the territories contested between the two sides, while demonstrating that neither possessed the military or political resources to impose their authority on the entire kingdom. Ethelred's death, on April 23, 1016, brought to an end his troubled reign, but did not resolve the political crisis, as his son Edmund Ironside inherited not a unified kingdom, but rather a desperate military situation, with Canute controlling substantial territories and possessing superior forces. Edmund's brief reign from April to November 1016 saw him demonstrating remarkable military energy and tactical capability, winning several battles against Cnut's forces and repeatedly raising new armies after defeats, but ultimately failing to reverse the strategic situation that his father had bequeathed him. The Battle of Asundun, fought on October 18, 1016, resulted in decisive defeat for Edmund, with his army shattered and many leading English nobles killed, finally breaking English resistance to Danish conquest. The treaty that Edmund negotiated with Cnut shortly after this defeat, partitioning England with Edmund retaining Wessex, while Cnut controlled Mercia and Northumbria, represented a temporary expedient that both sides apparently understood would not last. Edmund's death on November 30, 1016, possibly from wounds received at Asundun, though later sources would suggest assassination, left Canute as the sole king of all England and marked the final extinction of the West Saxon dynasty that had ruled England since Alfred's time. Cnut's reign as King of England from 1016 to 1035 initially rested on military conquest and the loyalty of Danish warriors who had fought to win the kingdom, but gradually evolved into a more sophisticated kingship that incorporated English political traditions, ecclesiastical structures, and administrative practices while maintaining Scandinavian cultural identity and military power. The political settlement that Canute imposed on England involved a mixture of continuity and change, with some English nobles retaining their positions, while others were displaced by Danish supporters, with ecclesiastical structures preserved intact and even strengthened through royal patronage, and with legal and administrative systems maintained largely as they had existed under Ethelred, but operated by a government that included both English and Danish personnel. The Ealdorman system that had provided regional governance under earlier kings continued under Canute, but with the title modified to the Scandinavian form Earl, and with several positions granted to Danish or Norwegian supporters, whose power derived from royal favour rather than inherited regional authority. The most powerful of these new earls, Godwine of Wessex, whose origins remain obscure, but who rose to extraordinary power during Canute's reign, exemplified the new political order where royal favour and political skill mattered more than ancient lineage. Canute's position as ruler of both England and Denmark, after inheriting the Danish throne in 1018, created an unprecedented political situation where the resources of England's wealthy kingdom could support ambitious projects in Scandinavia, while Scandinavian military power guaranteed the security of Cnut's English possessions. The conquest of Norway in 1028 added a third kingdom to Canute's domains and created what contemporaries recognized as a North Sea empire, linking Scandinavia and England in a political unit that dominated northern European politics. This achievement, while personally remarkable, rested on Canute's control of England's wealth, which provided the silver that could attract and maintain the loyalty of Scandinavian warriors, while funding diplomatic initiatives and military campaigns throughout the North Sea region. The costs of maintaining this empire, requiring continued heavy taxation of England to pay for household troops known as housecarls, diplomatic payments to potential rivals, and military forces in Scandinavia, represented a burden on English resources that generated resentment, even as the relative peace and security of Canute's reign provided relief from the chaos of Ethelred's later years. Cnut's careful cultivation of the English Church, demonstrated through generous patronage of monasteries, close relationships with ecclesiastical leaders, highly visible piety, including a pilgrimage to Rome in 1027, and the issuance of law codes that emphasized Christian morality and the protection of church interests, served both genuine religious devotion and calculated political purposes. The church provided the administrative expertise and literate personnel necessary for governance, the ideological support that presented royal authority as divinely sanctioned, and connections to continental European political and ecclesiastical networks that enhanced Cnut's international prestige. Archbishop Wulfstan of York, who had served Ethelred and Edmund before accommodating himself to Danish rule under Canute, exemplified the continuity that the Church provided between Anglo-Saxon and Danish rule, while also demonstrating the political flexibility of ecclesiastical authorities who survived regime changes by making themselves useful to whoever held power. Wulfstan's continued drafting of law codes for Canute, using language and concepts derived from earlier English legal traditions, while adapting them to serve the Danish king's political needs, created a bridge between English and Danish political cultures that facilitated Canute's transition from conqueror to legitimate king. Canute's death in 1035 created a succession crisis that revealed the fragility of his North Sea empire and the contingent nature of the unity that his personal power had maintained. The division of his domains among his sons, with Harold Harefoot claiming England, Harthacnut inheriting Denmark, and Norwegian nobles rejecting both to establish an independent kingdom under Magnus the Good, demonstrated that Snut's empire had been a personal achievement rather than a stable political structure that could survive his death. The brief reign of Harold Harefoot from 1035 to 1040, conducted under questionable legitimacy since many English magnates considered his brother Harthacnut the rightful heir, but that prince's preoccupation with defending his Danish kingdom against Norwegian threats prevented his coming to England, saw the gradual erosion of the political settlement that Snut had established. Harthacnut's arrival in England in 1040, with a Danish fleet shortly after Harold's death, initiated a brief restoration of Danish rule, but his sudden death in 1042, while attending a wedding feast, ended the Danish dynasty's control of England and created an opportunity for the restoration of the old West Saxon royal line. Edward, son of Ethelred and Emma of Normandy, and half-brother to Harthacnut through their shared mother, had spent most of his life in Norman exile after his father's flight in 1013 and his own departure as a young man seeking refuge from Danish rule. His accession to the English throne in 1042 reunited England with its pre-conquest royal dynasty, but brought to power a king whose formative experiences, cultural orientation, and political relationships had been shaped by Norman rather than English influences. The early years of Edward's reign saw him maneuvering carefully among powerful nobles, particularly Godwine of Wessex and his sons, who controlled the most powerful earldom in England and who possessed the military resources that could support or oppose royal authority. The crisis of 1051, when Edward attempted to break Godwine's power through charges that remain obscure in surviving sources, but appear to have involved the Earl's refusal to execute royal commands, temporarily resulted in Godwine's exile, but ultimately ended with the Earl's return and restoration after he assembled military forces that the king could not safely confront. This outcome demonstrated the practical limitations on royal power when confronted by a determined and well-resourced noble who could mobilize military support and who maintained sufficient legitimacy and political connections to resist royal authority. Godwine's death in 1053 brought to prominence his son Harold, who inherited the Wessex earldom and gradually emerged as the most powerful noble in England and the king's principal advisor and military commander. Harold's military abilities, demonstrated in campaigns against the Welsh kingdom of Gwynedd and in the suppression of internal unrest, combined with political skills and personal qualities that earned respect from fellow nobles and apparently from King Edward, positioned him as the dominant figure in English politics during the late 1053s and early 1060. Edward's childless marriage, whether the result of personal piety, as later hagiographic accounts would claim, or of political and personal circumstances that remain unclear, created a succession problem that became increasingly acute as the king aged and that would ultimately precipitate the crisis of 1066. The various potential heirs to the English throne, including Edgar the Atheling, descended from the old royal line, but a young boy with no political power base, Harold Godwinson, who possessed actual power but questionable hereditary claim, and William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed Edward had promised him the succession based on their shared Norman connections, positioned themselves for the struggle that Edward's eventual death would trigger. The complexity of English politics during Edward's reign reflected the multiple cultural influences and competing power structures that characterized mid-11th century England. The survival of Scandinavian settlement patterns, legal customs, and cultural practices in the Danelaw created regional variations that distinguished these areas from traditionally English territories in Wessex and Mercia. The influence of Norman culture at Edward's court, brought by Norman favourites whom the king appointed to positions, including ecclesiastical offices, generated resentment among English nobles who viewed these appointments as foreign intrusions. The continued power of great noble families like the Godwines, whose resources and political networks enabled them to operate semi-independently from royal authority, created decentralized political structures that limited the effectiveness of royal government. These various tensions, generally managed successfully during Edward's reign through careful political balancing and the king's willingness to compromise with powerful nobles, would explode into crisis when Edward's death removed the unifying figure whose legitimacy all parties accepted. Edward's death on January 5, 1066, after several weeks of illness, precipitated the succession crisis that had been building throughout his reign. The hasty coronation of Harold Godwinson on January 6th, the day after Edward's death, and conducted with unseemly speed that suggested fear of rival claims, asserted Harold's determination to secure the throne through fait accompli, while his military power remained sufficient to deter challenges. However, the rival claims of William of Normandy, supported by his assertion that Edward had promised him the succession and that Harold had sworn an oath to support that claim, and of Harold Hardrada of Norway, advancing dubious genealogical arguments connecting him to Canute's dynasty, ensured that Harold's accession would be contested. The year 1066, which would witness 3 major battles, 2 successful invasions of England, and the extinction of Anglo-Saxon political independence, began with Harold's government attempting to consolidate power while preparing for the foreign invasions that everyone recognized were coming. The Norwegian invasion, led by Harold Hardrada in alliance with Harold Godwinson's exiled brother Tostig, who had been Earl of Northumbria until his misgovernment provoked a rebellion that forced his removal in 1065, materialized first with a fleet sailing up the Humber River in September 1066. The defeat of the northern English earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria at the Battle of Fulford on September 20th demonstrated the Norwegian forces' military effectiveness and secured control of York, but also bought time for Harold Godwinson to march north from London with the Royal Army. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, fought on September 25, 1066, where Harold's army surprised and destroyed the Norwegian force, including both Harold Hardrada and Tostig, who fell in the fighting, represented a stunning English military success and seemed to vindicate Harold's accession by demonstrating his military capabilities. The completeness of the English victory, annihilating one of medieval Europe's most formidable military forces, and eliminating in a single afternoon both the Norwegian claim to England and the threat posed by Tostig's rebellion, marked the last great triumph of Anglo-Saxon arms and established Harold's reputation as a capable war leader. The arrival of news that William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast on September 28th, just 3 days after Stamford Bridge, forced Harold into an immediate southward march that would bring his army to the vicinity of Hastings in mid-October. The decision to engage William quickly, rather than waiting to assemble additional forces, resting his army after the exertions of the northern campaign, or attempting to trap the Norman force through siege operations, reflected Harold's calculation that rapid, decisive action offered the best chance of defeating William before the Duke could establish a secure base in England or receive reinforcements from Normandy. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, where Harold positioned his army on a ridge blocking William's route inland, and forced the Norman force to attack uphill against a defensive position, initially proceeded favourably for the English, with their shield wall holding firm against Norman cavalry charges and missile fire. The death of Harold, struck down late in the battle, possibly by an arrow, as later tradition maintained, though contemporary sources remain unclear about the specific circumstances, broke English morale and cohesion, allowing Norman forces to overrun positions that had held throughout the day's fighting. The English defeat, while not completely predetermined given the close-fought nature of the battle and the periods when Norman forces appeared to be failing, nevertheless reflected the superior tactical flexibility of combined arms Norman forces, integrating cavalry, infantry, and archery compared to the primarily infantry-based English army. The Norman conquest that followed Hastings proceeded through a combination of military intimidation, strategic positioning, and the collapse of English political unity, as different regional magnates calculated that submission to William offered better prospects than continued resistance without effective leadership. William's march from Hastings to London, conducting a circuitous route that devastated the countryside and demonstrated his military power while avoiding direct assault on London's formidable defences, convinced English nobles that further resistance would be futile and destructive. The submission of the surviving English magnates, including Edwin, Morcar, and Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury, their acknowledgement of William as king, and his coronation at Westminster on Christmas Day, 1066, provided the formal transfer of power that transformed military conquest into legitimate rule. However, the reality of Norman control over England would require years of campaigning against regional resistance, the construction of castles throughout the country to overawe local populations, and the gradual replacement of the English nobility with Norman supporters who could be trusted to maintain William's authority. The transformation of England under Norman rule, involving the wholesale replacement of the English aristocracy with Norman lords, the introduction of continental feudal structures, the reform of the English church along Norman and continental lines, and the integration of England into continental political systems centred on Normandy and France, marked the end of Anglo-Saxon England as a distinct political and cultural entity. The Domesday Book Survey of 1086, documenting in extraordinary detail the landholding patterns and economic resources of almost all of England, revealed the extent of the transformation, with virtually all major estates now held by Norman lords, while English landholders had been reduced to subordinate positions. The architectural transformation visible in the construction of Norman castles and cathedrals across England, the replacement of English bishops and abbots with Norman appointees, and the gradual transformation of the English language under the influence of Norman French, all demonstrated the comprehensive nature of the changes that William's conquest initiated. The survival of English cultural traditions, legal concepts, and administrative practices within the new Norman political framework created a hybrid Anglo-Norman civilization that would influence England's development for centuries. But the extinction of the Anglo-Saxon political order in 1066 marked a definitive break with the past and the end of a historical period that had lasted from the 5th century migrations to the Norman conquest. The legacy of Saxon England, preserved through its contributions to English law, language, literature, political traditions, and cultural identity, has exerted continuing influence on English and broader British development, despite the political destruction of Anglo-Saxon power in 1066. The common law tradition that emerged in medieval England incorporated principles and procedures that derived ultimately from Anglo-Saxon legal customs, including the jury system's roots in communal decision-making practices and various property law concepts that reflected Saxon rather than Norman origins. The English language itself, despite the massive influx of Norman French vocabulary following the conquest, retained its fundamental Anglo-Saxon grammatical structure and its core vocabulary, ensuring that Saxon linguistic heritage remained central to English linguistic identity. The literary tradition established by Anglo-Saxon poets and scholars, including the remarkable achievements of Beowulf, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and the rich corpus of religious and secular verse, provided foundations for subsequent English literary development, while preserving cultural memories and artistic techniques that influenced later writers. The political ideas about kingship, law, and the relationship between rulers and ruled that developed during the Anglo-Saxon period, including concepts about the conditional nature of royal authority and the rights of communities to participate in governance, influenced constitutional development in ways that would become particularly significant during the later medieval period and the early modern constitutional conflicts. The distinctive artistic achievements of Anglo-Saxon England, particularly in metalwork, manuscript illumination, and stone sculpture, demonstrated cultural sophistication and technical capabilities that challenged simple narratives about the progression from barbarian darkness to civilized light, revealing instead complex processes of cultural development that synthesized multiple influences into distinctive insular traditions. The enduring fascination with the Anglo-Saxon period in English historical memory, literature, and popular culture reflects the continuing power of this formative era to shape understandings of English origins and identity, despite the political rupture of the Norman Conquest that brought the Anglo-Saxon period to its dramatic and violent conclusion. The institutional frameworks that Saxon England bequeathed to its Norman conquerors, despite the comprehensive replacement of the political elite that followed 1066, proved remarkably durable and continued to shape English governance long after the extinction of Saxon political power. The system of shires and hundreds that had emerged during the 10th century as mechanisms for royal administration, tax collection, and judicial organization survived the conquest essentially intact, providing the Normans with ready-made administrative units that could be adapted to continental feudal structures without requiring wholesale reconstruction of local governance. The shire reeve, or sheriff, an official whose origins lay in the administrative innovations of the 10th century West Saxon kings, and whose responsibilities had expanded during the late Saxon period to include tax collection, judicial oversight, and the maintenance of royal authority at the local level, continued under Norman rule as the primary mechanism through which royal power reached into the localities, despite the sheriff now serving Norman rather than English kings. The 100 courts that had provided venues for resolving local disputes, witnessing land transactions, and maintaining communal order, since, at least the 10th century, persisted as functioning institutions throughout the medieval period, their procedures and customary practices preserving Saxon legal traditions within the framework of Norman feudal law. The very persistence of these institutions, requiring minimal modification to serve new masters, testified to their effectiveness as administrative mechanisms and demonstrated that Saxon political development had achieved genuine sophistication in creating governance structures capable of managing complex territorial kingdoms. The monetary system that Saxon England had developed, particularly the standardized silver penny established by Offa in the late 8th century, and maintained with remarkable consistency through the political upheavals of the Viking period and the Danish conquest, continued as the basis of English coinage for centuries after the Norman Conquest. The administrative infrastructure required to operate a coinages system across a kingdom-wide network of mints, to regulate the activities of moneyers who produced coins under royal authority, to maintain standards of weight and purity that preserved public confidence in the currency's value, and to manage periodic recoinages that replaced worn or debased issues with fresh currency, represented a level of administrative sophistication that few contemporary European kingdoms could match. The numismatic evidence reveals that late Saxon England operated dozens of mints distributed throughout the kingdom, each producing coins according to standardized specifications, while marking their products with distinctive symbols, identifying the mint location and the moneyer responsible for production. The artistic quality of late Saxon coinage, particularly issues from the reign of Edgar onward that featured increasingly sophisticated portraiture and decorative elements, demonstrated that these were not merely utilitarian objects for facilitating commerce, but also vehicles for projecting royal authority and prestige through the imagery and inscriptions that appeared on every coin. The Norman kings, who succeeded to the English throne, recognized the value of this monetary system and preserved it largely unchanged, demonstrating through this continuity that conquest did not necessitate the complete replacement of all Saxon institutions. The territorial organization of ecclesiastical England with its network of bishoprics, archbishoprics, monasteries, and parish churches that had developed over 4 centuries of Christian history, provided another dimension of institutional continuity that connected Saxon and Norman England, despite the political rupture of the conquest. The 2 archbishoprics at Canterbury and York, established during the 7th century, and maintaining throughout the Saxon period their competing claims to primacy and their respective spheres of influence over southern and northern England, survived the conquest with their territorial jurisdictions and hierarchical relationships essentially unchanged. The individual bishoprics, most of which had been established during the conversion period or the subsequent centuries of ecclesiastical organization, continued to serve as the fundamental units of church administration, despite the replacement of English bishops with Norman appointees during the decades following the conquest. The great Benedictine monasteries that had been founded or reformed during the 10th century monastic revival, including houses at Glastonbury, Winchester, Ely, Worcester, Ramsey, and numerous other sites, maintained their communities, their landed estates, and their liturgical and educational functions under Norman rule, providing institutional continuity that preserved aspects of Saxon religious culture, even as the political context transformed around them. The parish system that had emerged gradually during the late Saxon period, creating a network of local churches serving rural communities throughout England and supported through tithes and church dues paid by parishioners, provided the foundation for pastoral care and local religious life that would characterize English Christianity throughout the medieval period and beyond. The economic structures of late Saxon England, including patterns of agricultural organization, systems of commercial exchange, and relationships between rural production and urban consumption, reflected developments that had occurred over centuries of gradual evolution, from the relatively simple agricultural economy of the early settlement period to the more complex and commercialized economy of the 11th century. The transformation of agricultural practices during the Saxon centuries, from predominantly pastoral farming, focused on cattle and sheep herding in the early settlement period, to more balanced agricultural systems that included substantial arable cultivation by the late Saxon period, involved both expansion of the cultivated area through forest clearance and wetland drainage, and intensification of agricultural production on existing farmland through improved techniques and technologies. The archaeological evidence for changes in settlement patterns, including the gradual shift from dispersed farmsteads to nucleated villages during the Middle and Late Saxon periods, suggests fundamental reorganizations of rural society that created the village communities and open-field agricultural systems that would characterize much of medieval England. The mechanisms that drove these changes remain debated among historians, with some emphasizing population pressure and the need for more intensive land use, others highlighting lordly initiatives to reorganize estate management for greater efficiency and profit, and still others pointing to communal decisions by farming communities to coordinate their agricultural activities for mutual benefit. The development of specialized craft production and commercial exchange during the Saxon period, evidenced archaeologically through the concentration of craft activities in particular locations, the distribution of manufactured goods over considerable distances, and the appearance of standardized products suggesting workshop production for market exchange, created economic relationships that extended beyond local subsistence and connected different regions of England through trading networks. The pottery industry that flourished in certain regions during the Middle and Late Saxon periods, producing standardized vessels that were distributed across substantial territories through commercial exchange rather than local production for immediate consumption, exemplified the kind of craft specialization that characterized the evolving Saxon economy. The evidence for specialized metalworking sites, including locations where iron smelting, bronze casting, or precious metalworking occurred on scales exceeding the needs of immediate local populations, indicates the existence of craftsmen who produced goods for exchange rather than purely for local use. The circulation of these manufactured products through commercial networks, documented through the discovery of pottery, metalwork, and other artifacts at sites far from their production locations, demonstrates that Saxon England participated in market economies that connected producers and consumers across considerable distances. The trading settlements, or wicks, that emerged during the 8th century at locations including London, York, Ipswich, and Southampton represented a new form of urban development focused specifically on commercial rather than administrative or defensive functions, creating specialized economic zones where craft production, trade, and exchange occurred under conditions different from those prevailing in rural agricultural communities or in traditional urban centers. The planned character evident in the layout of these settlements, with organized street systems, defined property boundaries, and designated areas for different craft activities, suggests that their establishment involved deliberate royal or noble initiative rather than organic growth, with authorities recognizing the potential benefits of concentrating commercial activities in locations with good transport connections and providing the infrastructure and security necessary for traders and craftsmen to operate successfully. The abandonment or contraction of many of these trading settlements during the 9th and 10th centuries, coinciding with the disruption caused by Viking raids and the political reorganization that occurred during this period, indicates their vulnerability to external shocks and suggests that their commercial functions depended on relatively stable political and security conditions that the Viking Age disrupted. The gradual revival of urban commercial life during the 10th and 11th centuries, often occurring within the fortified burhs established for defensive purposes rather than in the specialized trading settlements of earlier periods, created a different model of urban development, where commercial, administrative, and defensive functions combined within single settlements. The relationship between royal authority and commercial development in late Saxon England involved complex interactions where kings sought to benefit from growing commercial activity through the collection of tolls and market dues, while also attempting to regulate trade to prevent fraud, maintain standards, and assert royal prerogatives over economically valuable activities. The law codes, issued by 10th and 11th century kings, included increasingly detailed provisions regarding commercial transactions, specifying where and under what conditions trade could occur legally, establishing penalties for fraud or the sale of stolen goods, and defining the responsibilities of witnesses who could testify to the legitimacy of transactions. The requirement that certain high-value transactions occur in the presence of official witnesses at designated market locations, documented in law codes from the reign of Aethelstan onward, represented attempts to bring commercial activity under royal oversight, while also creating mechanisms for resolving disputes and establishing clear property rights in exchanged goods. The minting of coinage under royal authority and the periodic recoinages that required the exchange of old coins for new issues provided another mechanism through which royal power intersected with commercial activity, creating opportunities for royal profit, while also maintaining the quality and standardization of the currency that facilitated commercial exchange. The social structures of Saxon England, characterized by hierarchical relationships, dependencies between lords and their followers, and distinctions between free and unfree populations, evolved significantly during the 4 centuries between the initial settlement period and the Norman Conquest. The early Saxon society, that can be reconstructed from archaeological evidence and from the limited written sources that survive from the conversion period, appears to have been organized around relatively simple status distinctions between free farmers who possessed land and participated in communal decision-making, dependent cultivators who worked land controlled by others, and an aristocracy whose power derived from military leadership, control of agricultural resources, and the ability to attract and reward followers. The gradual emergence of more complex and formalized social hierarchies during the Middle and Late Saxon periods, with increasingly precise legal definitions distinguishing between different ranks within both the free and unfree populations, and with more elaborate systems of wergild payments that assigned monetary values to individuals based on their social status, reflected the development of more stratified social structures as wealth became more concentrated and as royal authority expanded to regulate social relationships that had previously been managed through customary practices. The institution of lordship that characterized late Saxon society, creating personal relationships of dependency and obligation between lords who controlled land and resources, and their followers who provided service in exchange for support and protection. represented a fundamental organizing principle that shaped economic, military, and political relationships throughout Saxon England. The nature of these lordship relationships varied considerably depending on the status of both lord and follower, with the bonds connecting kings and their great nobles differing substantially from those linking minor landowners and their household retainers, and with regional variations reflecting different customary practices and historical developments. The evidence from late Saxon wills and land charters reveals complex webs of patronage and obligation, with individuals maintaining relationships with multiple lords simultaneously, and with the inheritance of lordship rights, creating enduring connections between families across generations. The military obligations that accompanied lordship, requiring followers to provide armed service to their lords and ultimately to the king, created the recruitment mechanisms through which Saxon armies were assembled, with the quality and reliability of these military forces depending heavily on the strength and effectiveness of the lordship bonds that motivated men to risk their lives in warfare. The institution of slavery in Saxon England, though poorly documented in surviving sources and therefore difficult to reconstruct in detail, represented a significant dimension of social and economic organization throughout the Saxon period. The enslavement of prisoners of war, particularly during the conflicts of the Conversion period and the Viking Age, provided one source of unfree labor, while debt slavery and the enslavement of criminals offered additional mechanisms through which individuals could lose their freedom. The children of slaves inherited their parents' unfree status, creating a self-reproducing population of unfree laborers whose work supported the agricultural economy and whose lack of legal rights placed them at the mercy of their owners. The treatment of slaves and the conditions under which they labored varied considerably, depending on the character of individual owners and the specific tasks they performed, with some domestic slaves in aristocratic households experiencing relatively privileged conditions, while agricultural slaves working on large estates faced harsh labor and minimal protections. The gradual decline of slavery during the late Saxon period, documented through the decreasing references to slaves in legal sources and the increase in references to other forms of unfree status that provided somewhat greater legal protections, appears to reflect both Christian moral teaching that questioned the enslavement of fellow Christians and economic changes that made other forms of dependent labor more efficient than outright slavery. The position of women in Saxon society, though subject to significant legal and customary restrictions that denied them many of the rights and opportunities available to men, nevertheless included spaces for female agency and authority that differentiated Saxon England from some contemporary European societies. The ability of aristocratic women to own and control property, documented through surviving wills, where women disposed of substantial estates, and through land charters, recording women's participation in property transactions, provided economic resources that could translate into political influence and social authority. The institution of the mourning gift, property transferred from husband to wife on the morning after marriage, and remaining under the wife's control even after the husband's death, created a mechanism through which women acquired independent economic resources that they could use to support religious institutions, provide for their children, or maintain themselves during widowhood. The position of abbesses governing double monasteries, communities that housed both monks and nuns under the authority of a female superior, demonstrated that exceptional women could achieve positions of genuine authority and responsibility within the religious sphere, even though they remained excluded from the formal structures of political power. The examples of Ethelflad of Mercia governing independently as Lady of the Mercians, and of various queens and royal women who wielded significant informal influence at royal courts, indicate that the formal legal disabilities imposed on royal women did not entirely prevent exceptional individuals from exercising power and shaping political developments. The intellectual culture of late Saxon England, while never recovering the heights achieved during the Northumbrian Golden Age of the 8th century, when figures like Bede produced works of enduring significance, and when English monasteries served as centers of European learning, nevertheless maintained educational institutions, preserved and copied important texts, and produced original works that demonstrated continuing engagement with Christian learning and Anglo-Saxon literary traditions. The monastic schools that educated young men for careers in the church or in royal service provided the basic educational infrastructure through which literacy and learning were maintained, with students progressing from elementary instruction in reading and writing through the study of Latin grammar, computus for calculating ecclesiastical calendars, and basic theology drawn from biblical texts and patristic commentaries. The libraries that major monasteries accumulated through copying activities, through gifts from kings and nobles, and through acquisitions from continental sources, preserved both classical Latin texts and Christian works that provided the textual foundations for intellectual activity, while also including historical works, vernacular literature, and practical texts on subjects ranging from medicine to agriculture. The production of manuscripts in late Saxon England, documented through the considerable number of surviving books from the 10th and 11th centuries, and through references in medieval library catalogues to works that have subsequently been lost, required substantial economic resources and institutional stability that only the wealthiest monasteries and churches could provide. The preparation of parchment from animal skins, the formulation of inks and pigments from various organic and mineral sources, the training of scribes to produce the distinctive late Saxon Caroline minuscule script and the elaborate decorative initials that ornamented important texts, and the binding of completed manuscripts in leather-covered boards with metal fittings, all represented skilled craft activities that demanded years of apprenticeship and access to specialized materials. The illuminated manuscripts produced in major scriptoria at Winchester, Canterbury, and other centres during the late Saxon period, including magnificent works like the Benedictional of Ethelwold and the Grimbald Gospels, combined sophisticated artistic techniques with expensive materials, including gold, leaf, and exotic pigments, to create books that served both liturgical functions and as symbols of institutional wealth and prestige. The vernacular literary tradition that flourished in Saxon England, producing works in Old English that ranged from translations of Latin religious texts to original poetry celebrating heroic deeds and exploring Christian themes, represented a unique achievement among early medieval European cultures where literacy remained predominantly associated with Latin and where vernacular languages were generally considered unsuitable for serious literary production. The decision by Alfred and his successors to sponsor translation programs that made important Latin works available in English, driven by concerns about declining Latin literacy, but also reflecting a positive valuation of the vernacular language as a medium for learning and religious instruction, created precedents for vernacular literacy that would influence English cultural development for centuries. The continued copying and transmission of Old English poetry, including works like Beowulf, that preserved pre-Christian Germanic heroic traditions within a Christian literary framework, demonstrated that vernacular literary culture maintained value even among educated elites who also possessed Latin literacy. The composition of new vernacular poetry during the 10th and 11th centuries, including works celebrating contemporary battles like Brunanburh and Malden, and religious poetry exploring biblical themes and saints' lives, indicated that Old English remained a living literary language capable of sophisticated artistic expression, rather than merely a vehicle for utilitarian communication. The architectural achievements of Saxon England, though suffering from the destruction and replacement that occurred during the Norman period and subsequently, can nevertheless be reconstructed from surviving structures, archaeological evidence, and contemporary descriptions to reveal building traditions that evolved from relatively simple timber construction in the early settlement period to sophisticated stone architecture in the late Saxon era. The great churches constructed during the late Saxon period, including major buildings at Canterbury, Winchester, and other ecclesiastical centres, employed architectural techniques and design principles derived from continental Carolingian and Ottonian models, while also developing distinctive insular features, including characteristic long and short work coining, triangular-headed openings, and pilaster strips that decorated external walls. The smaller parish churches constructed throughout England during the 10th and 11th centuries, hundreds of which survive at least in part despite later medieval and modern modifications, demonstrate the spread of stone building technology beyond the great cathedral and monastic churches to serve local communities. representing substantial investments of resources and labor that indicated both the economic capacity of local populations and the growing importance of organized parish worship. The sculptural traditions of Saxon England, producing stone crosses, architectural sculpture, and memorial monuments that combined Christian iconography with traditional Germanic decorative motifs, created works that served multiple functions, including marking important sites, commemorating the dead, proclaiming Christian messages to largely illiterate populations, and demonstrating the wealth and piety of their patrons. The great stone crosses, erected during the conversion period, and afterward, including monuments like the Ruthwell and Bewcastle, crosses with their sophisticated carved panels depicting biblical scenes and their inscriptions in both Latin and Old English runic characters, represented ambitious artistic projects that required skilled craftsmen capable of carving hard stone with precision and of translating complex iconographic programs into visual form. The tradition of decorating church buildings with carved stone friezes, panels, and architectural elements, documented through surviving examples and through fragments recovered from archaeological excavations at destroyed churches, created architectural environments where Christian teachings and symbolic programs surrounded worshippers and reinforced religious messages through visual means. The memorial stones erected to commemorate important individuals, sometimes incorporating figural sculpture depicting the deceased or including elaborate inscriptions recording their names and status, served both religious functions through their association with prayers for the dead and social functions through their public assertion of family prestige and the perpetuation of memory. The technological capabilities of Saxon England, while not achieving the kind of dramatic innovations that characterized later medieval technological development, nevertheless included significant practical knowledge in fields including metallurgy, textile production, and building construction that supported economic production and enabled the creation of sophisticated manufactured goods. The iron-working technology that Saxon smiths employed, producing tools, weapons, and architectural fittings through techniques including pattern welding that created blades with distinctive damascened surfaces, combining different qualities of steel, demonstrated mastery of complex metallurgical processes that required precise control of temperatures, careful selection of materials, and accumulated empirical knowledge about how different treatments affected metal properties. The production of textiles, including both utilitarian woolen fabrics for everyday clothing and elaborate silk and gold thread embroideries for ecclesiastical vestments and aristocratic display, employed technologies ranging from simple vertical looms for basic cloth weaving to sophisticated techniques for creating complex patterns in expensive materials. The agricultural tools and techniques that enabled increasingly intensive cultivation of the English landscape, including improved ploughs capable of turning heavy clay soils, scythes and sickles for harvesting grain, and specialized implements for various agricultural tasks, represented accumulated practical knowledge developed through generations of farming experience and incremental improvements to existing tools. The maritime capabilities that characterize Saxon England throughout its history, from the seafaring skills that enabled the original migration across the North Sea, through the naval forces that Alfred and his successors developed to contest Viking sea power, rested on sophisticated knowledge of ship construction, navigation, and seamanship developed through centuries of coastal living and maritime activity. The ships that archaeologists have recovered from Saxon contexts, including both the Sutton Hoo burial vessel and smaller craft found in rivers and coastal locations, reveal construction techniques that created flexible, seaworthy vessels capable of operating in the challenging conditions where rivers met the sea and where coastal shallows required vessels with limited draft but sufficient strength to handle open water. The navigation knowledge that enabled Saxon sailors to cross the North Sea, to raid along continental coasts, and to maintain commercial connections with Scandinavia and the Rhine Delta necessarily included understanding of tides, currents, coastal landmarks, and celestial navigation that allowed them to find their way across open water without the sophisticated instruments or charts that would characterize later maritime navigation. The harbor facilities and anchorages that developed at major trading centers and at defensible coastal locations creating infrastructure for loading and unloading cargo, maintaining vessels, and providing security for ships and their contents, represented investments in maritime capabilities that supported both commercial and military activities. The medical knowledge and practices of Saxon England, preserved in texts including herbal compilations and treatises on various ailments, combined inherited classical medical learning derived ultimately from Greek and Roman sources with Anglo-Saxon traditional healing practices and Christian religious healing through prayer and relics. The manuscript, known as Bald's Leech Book, compiled during the 9th or 10th century, and preserving remedies for various ailments, along with some theoretical understanding of disease and healing, demonstrates the kind of practical medical knowledge that was available to educated practitioners, while also revealing the mixture of empirical observation, magical thinking, and religious belief that characterized medieval medical understanding. The cultivation of medicinal herbs in monastic gardens and the knowledge of their properties and applications, documented through surviving herbal texts that described various plants and their medicinal uses, provided practitioners with pharmacological resources that could, in some cases, actually benefit patients through the therapeutic properties of the substances administered. The religious dimensions of healing, including pilgrimages to saints' shrines seeking miraculous cures, the use of relics believed to possess healing powers, and prayers for divine intervention in cases of illness, coexisted with more naturalistic medical approaches and reflected the integration of physical and spiritual understandings of illness and health that characterized medieval thought. The mechanisms of governance through which late Saxon kings attempted to exert authority over their expanding kingdoms evolved significantly from the relatively simple structures of early Saxon kingship, based primarily on military leadership and personal loyalty. The development of written records for administrative purposes, including land charters, recording property transactions, and establishing rights and obligations, law codes promulgating royal legislation and asserting royal authority over legal matters, and writs communicating royal commands to local officials, created a documentary infrastructure that enhanced governmental capabilities while also preserving evidence of administrative practices for modern historians. The royal household that travelled with the king and constituted the mobile centre of government included officers responsible for various administrative functions, including the management of royal estates, the collection of revenues, the maintenance of records, and the provision of justice, creating a proto-bureaucratic structure that complemented the traditional court functions of providing hospitality and demonstrating royal magnificence. The evolution of specialized financial administration, documented through references to arrangements for collecting royal revenues from various sources, including estate income, judicial fines, market tolls, and tribute payments, indicated increasing sophistication in managing the economic resources necessary to support royal government and military activities. The system of military obligation that enabled Saxon kings to assemble armies for defense against external threats and for offensive campaigns involved complex arrangements that evolved significantly during the Saxon period. The fyrd, the general levy of free men who owed military service based on their possession of land or their status within society, provided the fundamental mechanism through which early Saxon kingdoms assembled fighting forces, with all free men expected to respond to royal summons for military service when enemies threatened or when the king required forces for campaigns. The gradual evolution toward more selective military service during the late Saxon period, with obligations increasingly defined in terms of the hidage assessments that determined how much land owed service, and with professional warriors supplementing or replacing the general levy for extended campaigns, reflected both the increasing sophistication of military organization and the growing stratification of society that distinguished between aristocratic warriors whose primary social function involved fighting and common farmers whose military obligations competed with agricultural responsibilities. The household troops that kings and major nobles maintained, professional warriors who lived in their lord's household and whose primary occupation involved military service rather than agricultural production, provided a core of experienced fighters who could respond immediately to emergencies and who possessed the training and equipment necessary for effective military operations. The defensive systems that Alfred and his successors developed, particularly the network of fortified burhs that provided both refuge for populations threatened by Viking attacks and bases for military forces that could respond to invasions, represented sophisticated strategic thinking about how to neutralize the Viking advantages in mobility and surprise that had previously made English defenses ineffective. The construction and maintenance of these fortifications required substantial resources and organizational capabilities, with contemporary documents specifying the obligations of surrounding territories to provide men for garrison duty and to maintain the defensive works through regular repair and reconstruction. The burhs served multiple functions beyond purely military defense, with many developing into important commercial centers, where craftsmen and merchants operated under the protection provided by defensive walls and royal authority, creating a link between security and economic development that would characterize medieval urbanism. The gradual transformation of many burhs from purely defensive structures into settled towns, with permanent populations engaged in craft production and trade, indicated that the security they provided created conditions favorable for economic specialization and commercial development. The legal systems that operated in Saxon England involved complex combinations of royal legislation, customary practices that varied among different regions and communities, and ecclesiastical law governing religious matters and certain aspects of behavior that the Church claimed authority to regulate. The law codes promulgated by Saxon kings, beginning with the earliest surviving code issued by King Ethelbert of Kent around 600, and continuing through numerous codes issued by later rulers, including Alfred, Edward, Ethelstan, Edgar, and Ethelred, combined statements of new royal legislation with compilations of existing customary laws and regulations regarding ecclesiastical matters. The content of these codes reveals the range of concerns that occupied royal lawmakers, including the regulation of violence through wergild payments that substituted monetary compensation for blood feuds, the protection of property through laws against theft and fraud, the maintenance of royal authority through provisions requiring obedience to royal commands, and the support of Christian morality through legislation regarding marriage, sexual behavior, and religious observance. The judicial procedures through which these laws were enforced, operating primarily through local courts that met at regular intervals to resolve disputes and punish offenders, relied heavily on the testimony of oath helpers, who swore to the truthfulness of parties' claims, and on the participation of local communities in identifying wrongdoers and ensuring that judgments were enforced. The integration of Viking settlers into English society during the 10th and 11th centuries created a mixed population in the Danelaw regions, where Scandinavian and English cultural elements combined in complex ways. The archaeological evidence from areas of Scandinavian settlement reveals material culture that mixed English and Scandinavian elements, with grave goods, pottery styles, metalwork decoration, and building techniques showing influences from both traditions. The place name evidence demonstrating intensive Scandinavian settlement in certain regions, particularly in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and the Eastern Midlands, where names ending in by, Thorpe, and Thwaite appear with great frequency, indicate substantial Scandinavian populations that imposed their linguistic conventions on the landscape through the naming of settlements and geographical features. The legal distinctions that persisted between English and Danish law even after the political reunification of England under the West Saxon dynasty, with the Danelaw maintaining legal customs and procedures that differed from those prevailing in traditionally English territories, demonstrated that political conquest did not immediately erase the cultural and legal distinctiveness created by Scandinavian settlement. The gradual cultural assimilation that nevertheless occurred over generations, as Scandinavian settlers adopted Christianity, as intermarriage created mixed populations, and as the use of Scandinavian languages gradually declined in favor of English, produced a hybrid culture that incorporated elements from both traditions while creating a society that contemporaries recognized as distinctively English despite its mixed origins. The economic impact of the Viking Age on Saxon England involved both the destructive effects of raiding and warfare that destroyed wealth, disrupted production, and diverted resources from productive uses to military expenditure, and the potentially stimulating effects of increased commercial activity, the circulation of silver acquired through tribute and trade, and the urban development associated with Viking commercial centres. The massive tribute payments that English governments made to Viking forces during the late 10th and early 11th centuries, while representing an enormous drain on English wealth in the short term, may have had longer-term economic effects through the redistribution of silver that flowed back into England through commercial exchanges, and through the stimulus that the need to raise such large sums provided for increasing the distros, monetization of the economy, and the efficiency of tax collection. The growth of York as a major commercial centre during the period of Viking control, with archaeological evidence revealing extensive craft production and commercial activity that connected York to trading networks extending throughout the North Sea and Baltic regions, demonstrated that Scandinavian urban development could stimulate economic growth even while Viking military activity devastated surrounding countryside. The cultural interactions between Scandinavian settlers and English populations produced significant influences on English language, law, and social organisation that persisted long after the political integration of the Danelaw into the English kingdom. The numerous Old Norse loanwords that entered English during this period, particularly terms relating to law, administration, and everyday life, enriched the English vocabulary while also demonstrating the extensive contact and communication that must have occurred between English and Scandinavian speakers. The Scandinavian legal terms that appear in later English legal documents, including words like law itself and various technical legal vocabulary, indicate that Scandinavian legal concepts and procedures influenced English legal development beyond the Danelaw regions where Danish law formerly prevailed. The social terminology borrowed from Scandinavian languages, including relationship terms and words describing social relationships, suggests that patterns of social organization in Scandinavian communities influenced English social structures through the prolonged contact and cultural exchange that accompanied Scandinavian settlement. The religious transformation of Scandinavian settlers from paganism to Christianity, accomplished during the 10th century through a combination of missionary activity, political calculation by Scandinavian leaders seeking legitimacy and alliance with Christian rulers, and the gradual cultural assimilation that accompanied settlement in a predominantly Christian land, eliminated one of the primary cultural boundaries that had distinguished Viking invaders from the English populations they conquered. The establishment of churches in areas of Scandinavian settlement, documented through archaeological evidence and through surviving stone sculpture that combines Scandinavian artistic traditions with Christian iconography, created visible symbols of religious transformation while providing institutional frameworks through which Christian teaching and practice could be disseminated among Scandinavian populations. The incorporation of former Vikings and their descendants into English ecclesiastical structures, with Scandinavian names appearing among clergy and monastic communities by the late 10th century, demonstrated that religious conversion opened paths for social integration that transcended ethnic distinctions. The syncretic character of some early Christian art from areas of Scandinavian settlement, combining Norse mythological motifs with Christian symbols in ways that suggest the two belief systems coexisted during transitional periods, reveals the complex processes through which religious transformation occurred, rather than any simple replacement of pagan beliefs with Christian orthodoxy. The environmental context within which Saxon England developed included both opportunities presented by favourable climatic conditions during much of the period and challenges posed by periodic crises, including harvest failures, livestock diseases, and flooding that could devastate local economies and create subsistence crises. The medieval warm period that characterized climate patterns during much of the Saxon era provided generally favorable conditions for agricultural production, with evidence suggesting slightly warmer and drier conditions than the modern era that enabled cultivation of crops at higher elevations and latitudes than would later prove viable. The expansion of agricultural settlement into marginal lands during the late Saxon period, documented through place name evidence and archaeological surveys, revealing the establishment of new settlements in upland areas and in previously forested regions, reflected both population growth and the favorable climatic conditions that made cultivation of such areas economically viable. However, the The documentary evidence also records periods of famine and agricultural crisis, including several severe famines mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that caused widespread suffering and mortality, demonstrating the vulnerability of medieval agricultural systems to climatic variations and the catastrophic consequences that harvest failures could produce in societies living close to subsistence levels. The relationship between environmental change and political developments in Saxon England remains difficult to establish with certainty, given the limited evidence available. But some historians have argued that climatic deterioration during the 9th and 10th centuries may have contributed to the agricultural crises and social disruptions that created conditions favorable for Viking expansion. The possible connection between environmental stress in Scandinavian homelands and the increased migration and raiding activity that characterized the Viking Age remains speculative, but offers one potential explanation for the timing, a scale of Scandinavian expansion during this period. Within England, the relationship between environmental conditions and political stability operated through the mediation of agricultural production and the food supplies necessary to support populations and to generate the surplus wealth that enabled kings to maintain military forces and administrative structures, creating indirect linkages between climate, harvest, success, and political capabilities that help explain some of the variations in royal power and political stability across different periods. The transformation of the English landscape during the Saxon centuries, through forest clearance, wetland drainage, the establishment of field systems and settlements, and the construction of churches, fortifications, and other structures, created patterns of land use and settlement that would persist through the medieval period, and that continue to influence the modern English landscape. The place names that Saxon settlers imposed on the landscape, replacing Romano-British toponyms in many areas, and creating the fundamental nomenclature through which the English landscape would be known for more than a millennium, represented acts of cultural appropriation that inscribed Saxon identity onto the physical environment. The boundaries established during the Saxon period, including parish boundaries, estate boundaries, and the major territorial divisions of shires and hundreds, created frameworks that organized space and defined communities in ways that would structure English, social, and political geography for centuries. The churches built during the Saxon period, even those that have been rebuilt or replaced, often establish sites that have remained centers of Christian worship through continuous use for more than 1,000 years, creating remarkable continuities in the religious landscape, despite the massive changes in architectural styles and religious practices that occurred during subsequent centuries. The intellectual and cultural connections that linked Saxon England to continental Europe, operating through ecclesiastical networks, diplomatic relationships, dynastic marriages, and commercial exchange, positioned England within broader European cultural and political systems, despite the geographical separation provided by the Channel. The movements of scholars and manuscripts between England and continental centers of learning, continuing throughout the Saxon period, despite the disruptions of the Viking Age, maintained intellectual exchange that exposed English scholars to continental developments, while also allowing English contributions to influence continental learning. The participation of English ecclesiastics in continental religious developments, including the missionary work in Frisia and central Germany that English monks undertook during the 8th century, and the involvement of English prelates in ecclesiastical reform movements during the 10th and 11th centuries, created reciprocal relationships where England both received continental influences and contributed to continental religious culture. The diplomatic relationships that Saxon kings maintained with continental rulers, documented through treaty arrangements, dynastic marriages, and exchanges of gifts and embassies, positioned England as a participant in European international relations, despite its relative geographical isolation. The preservation of historical memory in Saxon England, through both written chronicles and oral traditions that were eventually committed to writing, created narratives about the Saxon past that would influence English historical consciousness and national identity for centuries after the Norman Conquest. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle continued at various monastic sites through the 11th century and even briefly after the Norman Conquest, preserved historical information, while also creating an interpretive framework that presented the West Saxon dynasty as the legitimate rulers of a unified England, and that constructed narratives about English origins and identity. The genealogies that connected Saxon royal families to legendary ancestors, and ultimately to pagan Germanic gods, preserved in historical sources, despite their obvious incompatibility with Christian theology, maintained memories of pre-Christian Germanic cultural traditions, while also legitimating royal authority through claims to ancient and prestigious lineage. The foundation legends that explained the origins of particular kingdoms and institutions, including the stories about Hengist and Horsa, establishing Kent, and various accounts of how different royal dynasties came to power, combined historical memory with legendary elements in ways that served contemporary political purposes while preserving fragmentary information about the distant past. The experience of conquest and foreign rule that characterized the final years of Anglo-Saxon England, first under Danish kings during Canute's reign, and then under Norman rule following 1066, created traumatic disruptions that would profoundly influence subsequent English historical development and cultural identity. The replacement of the English aristocracy with foreign lords, the subordination of English institutions to the priorities of foreign rulers, and the reduction of the English language from the language of government and elite culture to a subordinate vernacular spoken primarily by conquered populations, created conditions of cultural dispossession that English populations experienced as loss and humiliation. The preservation of English cultural traditions, historical memories, and linguistic practices, despite these adverse conditions, demonstrated the resilience of cultural identity and the limitations of political conquest to completely erase established cultural patterns. The gradual emergence during subsequent centuries of hybrid Anglo-Norman culture that combined elements from both English and Norman traditions while creating new cultural forms that could not be reduced to either parent tradition alone, demonstrated the dynamic character of cultural development and the creative possibilities that could emerge from the interaction between different cultural systems, even under conditions of conquest and political subordination. The Anglo-Saxon achievement in creating a unified English kingdom, developing sophisticated institutions of governance, establishing a rich literary and artistic culture, converting to Christianity, and building extensive ecclesiastical structures, and maintaining political independence for 4 centuries, despite repeated external threats, represented accomplishments of enduring significance that shaped English and broader British development in fundamental ways. The very concept of England as a unified political entity, and of the English as a people with shared identity and common political allegiance, emerged during the Saxon period, creating frameworks for collective identity that would survive even the political catastrophe of the Norman Conquest. The institutional frameworks that Saxon kings developed, the legal traditions that they established, the administrative practices that they created, and the cultural achievements that they sponsored, all contributed to foundations upon which subsequent English development would build. The Saxon legacy, while transformed and partially obscured by the Norman Conquest and subsequent historical developments, nevertheless remained embedded in English institutions, language, law, and cultural memory, ensuring that the Anglo-Saxon period would continue to shape English identity and to fascinate subsequent generations seeking to understand the origins and foundations of English civilization.